Sorry, boy, but his captain's got to teach his men what happens to those what crossing.
Captain's got to teach stuff.
Good morning from the Batcave. It is Friday, April 10th, 2026. Maps, y'all, maps. I know I've been promising this for a while. I'm not totally finished writing it yet, but I've wrote a substantial portion of it. I want to go ahead and give you guys a rundown on Hinduism pretty much from the formation of the civilization after the flood to the time and teaching of the Buddhists, the Jains, and the Brahmins, who are basically the main three sects running parallel to them. Brahmins come first, then the Jains and the Buddhists, but it's all within about a century. And then they all have their day in the sun as the dominant religion of India. Jains are promoted by Chandragupta, who's this Indian warlord who starts an empire after Alexander the Great comes through India. His grandson is going to promote Buddhism and actually evangelize it all over Asia. That's how it gets so prominent. And then the Brahmins are going to make a comeback and kind of not persecute them out, but largely come to dominate them, push them back to their temples and out of the state, if you will. And then the Muslims are going to basically get them completely out of India, pretty much. The Jains are going to survive. They're much more tribal and much more low-key, less monastic, less temples and stuff like that, and much more oral, and so they're going to survive, but the Buddhists are not going to survive in India, and so they're going to survive in very modified sectarian forms in places like Tibet, Japan, China, Sri Lanka, more southern India, Southeast Asia, where Buddha is anything from just like a god and an idol that they worship to being the reincarnation of various Bodhisattvas in Tibet, and it's just it morphs. It's a religion that morphs, and all Hinduisms are religions that morph. So I'm going to kind of take you through the history of how the Indians got there, what their cultural makeup was, and then how they get to Brahmanism, which is the first step. And what I'm learning as I'm now, I've read through the Upanishads, I'm reading through the Jain Sutras and the Pali Canon, which is like the oldest Buddhist, basically scriptures, if you will. And then comparing this to the stuff that's emerging in Greek philosophy from Solon and Pythagoras through Xenophanes and Parmenides and Heraclitus and Socrates and Plato and these guys. And they're just so parallel in their ideologies, and they're both coming from very different source materials that had a very ancient intersection in terms of their gods and myths and legends and stuff like that. I mean, really ancient intersection, like going back to probably the first centuries after the Tower of Babel, based on big expansive train routes that we're going to cover. And then they kind of settle into their canons by around, arguably in India as early as the 1200s, but definitely by about the 7th century, 8th century in Greece. They're oral in India. They're finally being written down in Hesiod and Homer in Greece, but there's still like a wide variety and variations on these myths and legends and gods and who's first and who's the top god and chief god, because there's a bunch of different little kingdoms and city-states on both sides. And, they have their different persuasions, different cultural backgrounds, different versions of these myths and legends. But they semi-canonize, and then out of that, they start asking these philosophical questions that lead to bigger picture cosmology and theology and soteriology and eschatology and where's this all going, They just start settling into a systematic theological religion around the time, ironically, that the Hebrew canon is being completed. So literally you can just map Plato, which is kind of the finalization of this, and Aristotle is more like the more systematic expression of Plato, where Plato is mostly dialogues, and there's such a parallel between these guys and like Buddha and to the Brahmins. And then Alexander tries to basically spread that worldview throughout the world. It's essentially Aristotle's worldview, that he is, it's not that these guys aren't still syncretic and still evolving in their faith, but that basic worldview and that dialectical process of gathering all the information together to kind of come up with who God is on the basis of the idea that God is perspectively in everyone, which is almost the exact same idea as Brahmanism. starts to just be spread throughout the earth. So I'm going to kind of walk you through where this starts, where the raw ingredients are, where the original gods seem to come from, both in terms of ancestor worship and in terms of original gods that are mostly influenced by the Sumer in Egypt, just like everybody else, and then variations of ideas that come from Aryan descriptives, because their god names and their ancestor names and their family names are largely descriptions of what people do. That's just an Aryan trait in terms of names. That's why we have names like Smith and Farmer, and they just tend to name people after what they do instead of who they were. And their original names get lost. That's just an Aryan trait. I don't know why. But anyways, going back to this map here I found, this is a map that essentially establishes the ancient trade routes that would have existed from pre-flood, really, and then to the time of the post-flood era, prior to the Tower of Babel, this BMAC civilization dispersing along with the Tower of Babel dispersing. Think of this as like the Japhethite capital, and this is like the Hamite/Semite capital, with Egypt being secondary to that. But it's not really like one big city that's the capital of Egypt, whereas Babylon is. So it's really simple. Noah, the ark's going to land right here. They're going to start moving down river and probably start settling. I suspect that they start settling in the Haran region, just because that they would just be following the river down from there, and they might have different parties that are going in different directions from the beginning. But it's not a huge family at first, and to establish farming as a colony, you would pretty much need everyone in one place to get the irrigation and all that stuff going, and they seem to get that going over in the Harappan region, which is 20 miles south of Göbekli Tepe. So my theory is that Noah and his family are the ones who unburied Göbekli Tepe, and it was Noah that ordered it reburied, and that's why they have it like this. Again, I think a lot of their claims that it is 6,000 years older than Sumer and all this stuff, I think that's all debatable. I mean, that would just throw the entire Bible into suspicion. And if you want to hang your hat on carbon dating, there's a lot. It's a lot less credible than scientists like to make it seem. And I'm not an expert in disputing that. Others are. But anyways, Noah seems to send Japheth and his family within 50 years of the flood to go settle over here and start mining for tin to get the tools that they need to advance civilization. And the reason I suspect is because if Noah's building the ark up here, he was probably getting his metallurgical needs met from colonies that were there before the flood. And he knows where they are, and Japheth knows where they are, because he's, anywhere between, could be 80 to 100 by the time they get in the ark. So he knows where they are. And they're just going to go there. They're going to uncover existing civilizations. And when you start to process the ancient world and the post-flood world, just imagine they are in a habit of uncovering existing civilizations. Most of these civilizations are going to expand in the first place, up and down rivers and along coastlines. So common sense is they're just going to follow the same path, and then they're going to, there used to be a colony here. Let's dig it up and rebuild something here. Why? Because the people who lived before that lived to be 1,000 years old. So I think they probably picked some decent spots for cities and stuff. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Why relay the foundations and dig up quarry stone again when you have foundations that are there? So anyways, the BMAC, stands for Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, okay? Another name for this is the Amu Darya civilization, because Amu Darya is the river. I forget what it's called now. It's got a Russian name, but I forget what its name is. But Amu Darya, or the BMAC, that's what archaeologists call it. And it's really a civilization, so it's a bunch of cities that are definitely Japhethite. We have white people with big, thick coats on, and it suggests that there was a big ice age. That would have been probably north of this region here. And I suspect that, for a time, for the centuries leading up to around the death of Ham, which seems to be, again, Ham, Shem, and Japheth seem to live to around maybe 1800, so 100 years before the Tower of Babel at the earliest, 100 to 150 years. And so Japheth is going to go up here. He's ultimately going to die back here in Azerbaijan in the Ararat region. So Noah is going to be buried there too. And you're going to hear one of the first mythological stories after the Tower of Babel that mentions the confusion of languages, talks about the lords of Arata. Well, that makes a lot of sense if Noah and Japheth are there, and their sons that ultimately bear the roots back to the lapis lazuli and the tin mines, which are the subject of Enmerkar and the lords of Arata, is getting the lapis lazuli flowing again so they can build a temple to Ishtar. They need to get the approval of the lords of Arata, or the lords of Ararat, in order to get their relations over here, because we're post-Babel, to start getting the stuff flowing again, okay? So that's what it's about. People are like, oh, maybe Arata is down here. No, it's Ararat. It's just really simple. You can tell there's this mythological, you got to get past the 7 mountains to get there, and it's like, it's not clear. But the last thing your archaeologists and your secular mythologists are going to do is look to the Bible to explain things. They just won't, okay? So this route is traveling here, and you see this route that is basically going through the Zagros Mountains. This is essentially where today the Kurds are, but the Medes were, and then it's going to go through what becomes the Assyrian Empire, but before that was basically just the Semites. And these Semites here are going to be taken over by Nimrod, okay? Nimrod is Sargon of Akkad, and when we get into the Vedas, we find out Krishna, which means the black one, which is the same meaning for the name Kush, just like Manu means the man, which is the exact same meaning for the name Adam. His son is the one who goes to the Nasatya twins and pleads with them to help him because some warlord, some usurper, some tyrant has taken over the region and kidnapped his son, which would have been a common thing kings would do to take over, is take your son as a hostage, and basically if you people submit to me or your son's going to get it, okay? And so he's going to the Asadin twins, or the Nasatya twins, which are, I believe, to be Japheth and Shem, to say, help, this guy has kidnapped my son and he's a tyrant. Well, this seems to be describing a son of Cush, who would have been then the legitimate heir to the realm that that Sargon takes over. Sargon also is a son of Cush, but he's a younger bastard son of a later wife or concubine or something. He takes over the region, and he goes to these two to get relief. And this is where the myth, which is all over the Japhethite world, of the Nasatya twins, or these chariot riding twin brothers, and in India one of them's white and one of them's brown skin, so it's Japheth and Shem, rescue the world from this people. And this seems to happen by way of the Amorites coming from the west, sent by Shem, because remember they would have been in the surrounding region where Melchizedek was, and then the Gutians, or the Goths, sent by Japheth, and they basically hit them from both sides, and over the course of a couple decades they overthrow Sargon's kingdom. And then the Japhethite Gutians or Goths are going to sit there and basically rule over it, but they're really just dominating it to make sure it doesn't rise again until the Amorites come and take it over. And this actually makes a lot of sense, because the Amorites would have been the older brother, Amartu, or Amar would have been the older brother of the Sinites and Zemarites, who were the people who were occupying Shinar and Sumer. Okay, Shinar, think the Babylon region. Sumer, think more towards the south, but they're probably all mixed together. Okay, so you have two different names for them, Shinar and Sumer. The name Sumer is given to them, seems like, by Sargon, who basically exalts the Sumerians over the Sinites, but then he exalts Sin as, their primary ancestor deity in their pantheon, as a means of pacifying the Sinites. But you have nobles that are overthrown. And those nobles that are overthrown, the Sinites, are going to migrate away towards China. And so the first place they're going to go, because they're getting their tin, their lapis lazuli here, it's not like you just have nonstop civilization here, nor here. You have long routes to civilizations that are there for a purpose in different places to get certain materials, okay? So the primary grain belt for the whole world is this pretty much until the time of Joseph, and then Egypt starts becoming another grain belt, okay? And so they're over here getting tin, lapis lazuli, other metals, but tin's the main one because you need it to make bronze. And so they're going to go here where they've had these trading partners, these nobles, and they're going to be up in this BMAC civilization. And out of this, as these ice caps melt, they're going to start to disperse through the Turkish and the sons of the Togarma and Magog, which become the Turkish and Mongoloid peoples, which are always mixed because they're really wide-ranging horse tribes that both have clan relationships with intermarriage. Also, they have war relationships like the Native Americans, where you might have kidnapping brides or just conquering peoples and making them your slaves. But you would assume probably before the Tower of Babel, it's mostly peaceful. And so what you're going to have is these people, these Turkish and these Turkish and Mongoloid peoples, essentially, mixing and intermarrying with the Sinites. And the Sinites, we know the people of Sumer, which these are these Canaanites in the south, were called blackheads. We know both the Chinese and the Mesoamericans, which I believe is the main division between the Sinim and the Zemarem, which are basically the Sinites and the Sumerites, become the Chinese and Mesoamericans as their primary division. Again, these people are going to mix with other people, and then when the languages get confused, they're going to genetically consolidate, and so those traits are going to come back to being more pronounced as per their original parentage. Okay, and we're going to show you some examples of that. But what you're going to have is numbers of Chinese people, Sinites, Chinese people, that are going to eventually consolidate in China. However, that genetic trait of black hair, and to lesser degrees in the Turks than in the Mongols, because they're further east and more intermarried with them, of the monolid eye, or the Chinese eye, if you will. It's basically an eye that has a different shape of eyelid, where it doesn't fold like most people's eyes do, and that's where you get the kind of squinty, folded over eye. That seems to be a Sinitic characteristic that is very much spread among the sons of Magog, much more so than among the Persians and the Turks, but somewhat so among them as well. Okay, so you want to imagine that these people are mixing and mingling here in this BMAC civilization from the time of Sargon, which I would put conservatively in the late 20th century BC, so 1920 BC-ish, around that time. Shem and Japheth are still alive for like a century. They overthrow him, and then you're going to have from that time to the time of the Tower of Babel, you're going to have roughly 200 to 250 years, okay? And it's the time of the Tower of Babel that they're going to start to separate out again. And so this is around 1700 BCE, and that's why the BMAC civilization just seems to disperse after 1700 BCE. And so what you have is these existing colonies of these people from this area that are going to be spread up these river systems up into the Ural Mountains. These river systems flow down into the Black and Caspian Sea, but they're going to flow from the Himalayas, from the Ural Mountains, from the Himalayas north, and it's the spread of these river systems that's going to lead these distinct people to become the Finno-Uralic language family, which is basically a Russian/Finnish people that, again, they're going to continue to mix afterwards. The Slavic peoples is going to be the sons of Meshech, which they're going to actually be in Turkey, it seems, and they're going to migrate up there later. But these colonies, these Japhethites would have all spoke the same language and been intermarried and been here and then spread out from here to all these other places. But a lot of these guys would have had colony cities in Turkey because that's where their main nobility was headquartered, because Japheth and Noah died there. Okay, so as their nobility is headquartered there, it makes sense that they have cities around this area where the main primary lords of Arada, or the sons of Japheth, are. Okay, while other people are going to stay behind in these other regions and populate this and continue to trade. And so you see these orange road systems, and basically this is just the road from essentially the not Mesoamerica, but Mesopotamia to the BMAC civilization, where they're getting their tin. Very simple. And then the second road is going to be from Elam, the Elamites, going towards there to get their tin. And then the third road is going to be down towards Harappa from the BMAC civilization, and that's because the Hamites are going to come across. We actually have this map here that I made. The Hamites are going to spread down, and I'm making Göbekli Tepe in the Haran region kind of that center point where they seem to disperse peacefully before there's any confusion of tongues or warfare or anything like that. And Ham and his descendants, primarily led by Canaan, they're going to start to unearth these pre-flood civilizations up here in Syria. They're going to come down and start unearthing them in Canada. They're going to come down and start unearthing them in Mizraim. And there may have been a deliberate division of the lands by Noah, but more than likely he's sending Japheth to just where the tin is, and Japheth is the most crafty of them. Ham seems to be the scholar of them, and Shem seems to be the shepherd of them. He seems to be the wise, peaceful shepherd of them, okay? And Ham seems to be the scholar, and so he seems to be inclined towards archaeology, as is his youngest Canaan, okay? And so they seem to be leading in the digging up of things, but also Ham's wife, I suspect her to be a dark-skinned woman from antediluvian Egypt. And the reason is because the way the Semites would say the name Ham is Chem, and the way they would name the wife of a person would be Chemet. Okay, and you're going to see this in Egyptian. Nu or Noah is going to be called Nu, and his wife's going to be called Naunet. It's a common thing also in some Egyptian. Remember, there's like 7 Egyptian tribes here, and some of those tribes put an N at the end of male names. So Nu is Noon. You're just going to see a version with an N and a version without. And you're going to see the same thing in India among the Kushites, who are basically closely related to the Egyptians. Okay, so you're going to see Noon and Nunet. And then the Egyptian name for Ham is Ammon, and his wife is Ammonnet. But the Semitic name for Ammon, there seems to be a couple. There seems to be Aminu, which seems to be more of a Sumerian Semitic designation, Aminu. So Ammon with a U at the end of it. That seems to be a Canaanite thing, or a Western Mesopotamian thing. I don't know if it necessarily comes from Sumer, but the U at the end seems to be Sumerian, okay? And then you have Ammon and Ammonit is what the Egyptians call them, and then Ham and Chemet seem to be what the Hebrews call them. And so the name they call Egypt, the oldest name they find for post-Diluvian Egypt, is Chemet, which seems to be named after Ham's wife, which would make sense if that's where she's from before the flood, that they'd be naming it after. And if she's got dark skin, there could have been tribes of people who had dark skin there before the flood. There seems to be evidence of both sons of Seth and sons of Cain in Egypt, like one in the north, one in the south. And then there's some warfare after Adam dies, and Seth is the god Set, and I've covered that in Egypt, so I'm not going to cover it here. And then the Kushites are south of that, because again, they're just migrating up the Nile River to what is eventually going to become Ethiopia. But then they're going to go over here because, again, they know where this stuff is. We have very old maps that show that they knew what was over here. And they're going to basically go across the rivers, and they're going to go up into here because the Canaanites would have had colonies over here in what's Western Iran or Elam, over here in what's Kush, probably along here too, but then up here in India, which is going to be the antediluvian Harappan civilization, okay? The Harappan civilization is just named after a city that they called Harappa, or maybe discovered to be archaeologically called Harappa, but most of these names of these cities are much later Aryan designations of ruins and stuff like that. These are not their original names because nobody's ever figured out the language and script, okay? So it's called the Harappan civilization after Harappa, which seems to be a capital of a network of cities around the upper Indus River. And so these tributaries that form the Indus River, which is huge, they named this place the Hindu Kush. Kush is named after Kush, which remember the Kushites are gonna come from here. So the Hindu is the U. There's a Sumerian U because the Sumerians are gonna come over here too. But that's just their designation for it. Others is going to be Hindi, and the word Hind, Hind, or in that is the Iranian designation. The Indo-Iranian designation is Sind. They're always exchanging the S and the H, Sind and Hind just means the river. So Hindu Kush literally means the river of Kush. Okay, Hindu is kind of like a definite article, so the river of Kush. Okay, most of them are not going to have enough. The river of Kush. And the place called the Hindu Kush is where these tributaries float from, and you see Ham's burial site is traditionally held to be here in Pakistan. I have no reason to argue that. When Noah finally dies and he gives his blessings to Shem, Ham, and Japheth, he gives no blessing to Ham. He curses Canaan, who by this time has revived Nephilim in a competitive priesthood to what Noah is trying to establish through Shem. And so Shem and Japheth get a blessing, Canaan gets a cursing. And that seems to be the basis for the world order, based on how he set this up. So the Canaanites, it says they start out right here. It names their territory because it's the same territory that the Israelites are going to get. And then it says from there they spread abroad. So they don't get the territory wherever the Canaanites spread. They get their original home territory, which suggests that there was a territory designated, like there were territories designated by Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth before they died, and then the Tower of Babel further dispersed people out. But the Canaanites are going to produce the Sinaites and the Zemarites here that are ultimately going to migrate into Mexico and China. It's going to produce the Sidonians, which are become the Phoenicians, and they're going to go establish Carthage. It produces the Hittites, which are going to go up in here and establish the Hittite Empire, mixing and mingling with a bunch of Japhethite languages. And then it produces the Amorites, which are going to take over Mesopotamia and name it Babylonia. They're actually the ones who build the city that becomes Babel, which means confusion. Okay, Bab Elu is the name that they name it. There's the U at the end. Bab Elu means city of the gods. Il means gods. So you have El in Canaan. Il is in Babel. Bab means gate, and U means the. Okay, gate of the gods. But it also means Babel in Hebrew means confusion, and so these ways of having a transliteration that has a different name meaning is a very common thing after the Tower of Babel, and so you need to work that into your analysis as you're going from one language over. Remember, you're going to have a word that sounds similar but has a very different meaning that another place is going to call it, and then they're going to link it to the rote memory of what that person did, what happened at that city, yada, 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 okay? And so as you're looking at your analysis across language, you want to keep these tools in mind that is going to happen in the confusion of language. What came first, the chicken or the egg? Did Babel mean confusion, or did Babel become their word for the confusion because Babel is just that's the Hebrew designation for Babelu, which means gate of the gods. But it came to mean confusion because that was the place where the confusion of languages seemed to originate, or seemed to be the most pronounced. What came first? Did the meaning come from the name of the city? In other words, did the transliteration become the meaning, or see what I'm saying? Or did the meaning come the word? And I think the city meant gate of the gods, and then it came to mean confusion, and so the word Babel or Babel just means confusion. You don't make no sense. You're babbling. Okay, and you're going to have versions of this all over the world with various things that we're going to get into. Again, Shamash means the name of he who is. It literally means that in Semitic, but it becomes the name for the sun to the Semites, Utu to the Canaanites, Ra to the Egyptians, and they're just the name for this sun deity or deity that is associated with the sun, who knows everything you're doing wrong, and he's like the son of another god who is more transcendent and has to do with the heavens. So he's the god of the heavens, and you're going to hear him called Deus. You're going to hear him called Anu, which seems to be merging him with Noah. Sign gets merged with the moon god, and you're going to have versions of like an overthrow of civilization where they start putting the moon god at the head of the pantheon instead of the sun god. So there's like a Gnostic inversion thing going on, okay? So you have these Sinites from Shinar starting with their nobility and mixing with these Japhethite tribes for about 200 years before the Tower of Babel. That's a significant amount of time. These are the nobles who are overthrown by Sargon. They're not just going to submit, they're going to go away. That's what they're going to do. It's not like you're going to set a guard on them. Some of them are stuck behind, But their original exodus probably has to do with them saying, help us, Japhethites, we've been overthrown by this tyrant. Zemarites are going to start to disperse from here. They're actually going to be exalted by the Sargon's Akkadian nobility, but then they're going to be subjugated by the Amorites. And so they're going to lose their high noble status, but they're still a semi-nobility. It's like they're lords of their territory. But then when the Tower of Babel happens, now they don't even speak the language. They're on the outs, okay? And so a new language is starting to form between the Amorites and Akkadians that remain there, and that's why the Amorites are going to be known to speak Semitic language. The Hittites are going to be known to speak Japhethite languages because they're surrounded by Ludites, which are the Luwians, but they're primarily surrounded by Greeks, Thracians, and other Japhethite tribes. And so their language structure becomes Japhethite, while the Luwians, which are Semite, and the Hittites, which are Hamite, are going to be the main two names for the language, Hittite and Luwian. Lud is Luwian, and then Lydia is just, the Y is a U in Greek. So Ludians and Lydians, same things. And they pronounce it Luwians because Hamites can't pronounce for crap. And so you're going to have a Japhethite language structure. You're going to have Hittite and Ludian pronunciation as the main two because they're the main tribal groups that are there, while the Amorites being surrounded by Akkadians here, Hebrews here, and in both places. So you think the predecessors to the Babylonians and the Israelites and the Arabs, their language is going to be, it's going to have some Amorite, Canaanite versions of it, so you're going to see oohs at the end of stuff, but it's going to be a primarily Semitic structured language, okay? So the Zemarites are kind of out here, and this is why. People document, and it's very clear, Sumerian is a language isolate. Well, it's not a language isolate because, they have no relation to the Amorites. The Amorites are their cousins. However, the Amorites are the nobility and, the military power over an existing Sinite/Akkadian nobility who, after, the Tower of Babel, they're going to merge their linguistic structures into a new language, which essentially becomes the Akkadian language that is remembered. These are languages, remember, Akkadian is named after Akkad, which is the center of their civilization. These languages were not distinct before that. They were just all cuneiform, and cuneiform has pronunciation, but that pronunciation was established after the Tower of Babel. And so you have two different forms of the script. One is Sumerian, which is more of a pictographic script, that somewhat starts to evolve towards some syllabic, like cat, dog, one syllable words and stuff like that. And then the Akkadian becomes much more of a syllabic script. And so it's the advancement of the script, and then the pronunciation of the script is going to evolve from all the places where the script is used, but the meaning of the language is going to stay basically the same because it's written. So these people are going to evolve rather quickly to straighten out their languages into a main few, which is basically Akkadian down here, Aramaic over here, and then Hebrew over here. And then the Hebrews are going to go into Egypt and get a script that is going to become Proto-Hebrew. So they're going to be kind of distinct, and then eventually the Aramaeans are going to develop a new script, I think, under the Assyrians, and that's going to take over most of the rest of the ancient Near East, and then the Israelites are going to eventually adopt that. So we've got about 100 years of people from Sumer moving down here and towards the Harappan civilization where they had pre-existing trade relationships. 200 years of Sinites moving up here where they had pre-existing trade relationships. And then you also have these Aryans who are coming down here where they have pre-existing trade relationships. Because remember, they're not the Semites, Shamites, and Japhethites, they're not at war with each other. Before the Tower of Babel, the only real warfare going on is Sargon trying to take over a peaceful civilization and claim that, Noah wanted him in charge instead of Shem. That's basically what he's doing. And so you have this third route here, which is from the BMAC civilization down to Harappa. Well, the Aryans aren't coming in here conquering. They're trading and intermarrying, just like they all speak the same language. And then once the languages start to separate, the people are just going to naturally start to separate. And if you see Harappa up here, well, the Aryans are going to go upriver, and the Dravidians are going to go downriver. That's basically mostly what happens. It's kind of like Abraham with Lot. They're not trying to kill each other. They're mostly separating because they speak a different language. And, from Harappa, you have the Aryans going up, and you have the Dravidians going down. Now, we know that they're different. We know that their gods are distinct. We know very clearly that Rama, Shiva, and Krishna are all black Dravidian gods. Well, that's because Krishna means the black one. That's Kush. Rama and Shiva are Rama and Sheba, who are the two sons of Kush, who with Ham went and settled this region. And Ham goes over here, and he becomes, by his Canaanite designation, Yama. The Iranians call him Yima. The Canaanites over here call him Yam. And he's associated with the sea or flooding in every one. And then in the east, among Canaanites and around the Himalayas with death. Hima, which is a translation of Yima, Laya means abode of Ham. Or Yima, Hima. It's really easy to see how a confusion of language could pronounce a he as a ye. In fact, when you go to Egypt, they call Ham Ammon. When you go to Assyria, they call him Aminu. When you go to Canaan, they call him Yam. Okay? When you go to Sumer, that's Canaanite, their word for amen is Hiam. There's where Yam comes from. When you go to Akkad, their word for amen in a prayer is Aminu. Aminu. When you go to the Hebrews, who are closest to Egypt, their word for a prayer is Amen. Amen. Okay? That's where we get amen from. They seem to sound like the name of Ham everywhere. And my theory as to why is because Ham seems to have been an intercessory god of the dead all over the world. He was probably of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the first to die of them. And all around this region, he becomes the god of the dead and the one who they associate with safe passage to the next life, like they did with Demuzid or Abel before the flood. And so Yama or Yima or Yam or Amen or Haman or Aminu, we have similar things we find in Egypt in these definitely post-Diluvian coffin scripts that talk about how this guy's going to say these magical prayers that's going to get him to go to the place where Amen and Nu are, so where Ham and Noah are. Okay, you have very similar things in the Vedas that talk about how these people are, appealing to Yam, or Yama is going to be the one who collects their body and brings them to the place, and eventually he's going to be a guy who lives in the moon and is in charge of reincarnation. But he becomes this god of the dead all around the Himalayas. So in China, Japan, Southeast Asia, Yima, okay? And then the Iranians, the Avestans, are eventually going to come up with this flood myth that involves Yima, but it's not a flood, it's an ice age. And it's very similar to the Atrahasis myth, where God's going to destroy the world because of reincarnation, and he keeps trying to come up with solutions to it, but he ultimately has to destroy humanity because of overpopulation. And here he does it with a flood, and the guy who saves him is Atrahasis or Zeusudra or Upatnishim, which two of the three mean basically the guy with long life, he who was given long life, or Atrahasis means the exceedingly wise. Okay. Over here in the Hindu land, they call him Vivasvant, and because it's an Aryan designation, Viva, life, life, Viva, vivification, life, okay? So Vivasvan means growing or extending in life. So it's the one with long life, okay? That's Noah, and it says that Yama is his son. Him and his wife, and Yama is his son. So Yama is described as the one who led them to here for their pasture for their cows and gave them this beautiful land. And he is generally regarded as a god of again, he's like an ancient forefather god who becomes a god of death. But there's hymns designated to Yama and Yami, who is his wife. So apparently, the E versus the A is a way of designating the feminine among their Indo-Aryan language afterwards. So, of all the Hindu gods in the Rig Veda, The one that is most prominent is Indra, seconded by Agni. Agni seems to just be Enki, and it's just switching around the N and the G, and that's something that tends to happen in the confusion of languages, is a word seems almost the same, but two letters are switched around. It's similar to how I describe how a lot of African Americans will say the word axe instead of ask. Well, think about the capital of Ethiopia as Aksum. Okay, so without knowing too much about African linguistics and the languages they come from, I suspect that their language structure, it's much more common to have an SK or an RKS in a word than an SK. And so when we say ask, it's hard to pronounce. It's not natural for them to pronounce because of the confusion of languages, and they have differences. And you have similar things with Japanese confusing L's and R's. You have similar things between us and Vietnamese with N and G. They have N and G at the beginnings of words. We only have it at the end or in the middle. Okay, there's just things like that are pronunciation traits that language groups are just going to switch two letters around because it's easier to pronounce in their word. And Agni just happens to be related to, and again, what came first, the chicken or the egg, is a mystery that I don't know. Agni, the word ignite seems to come from Agni. And Agni himself is the high priest who makes the fire that they offer the sacrifices with. And Agni seems to be Enki. He is confused with Enosh. Enoch and Enosh sound a lot alike. And what seems to be is Enosh is the first Ensi, so priest of the city is Ensi. Enoch is the first high priest or priest of the world. Enki literally means priest of the world, or lord or priest of the world, and they're offering up sacrifices for the whole. So you have a system that's expanding from the time of Adam and Seth to the time of Adam's death, and which is where he puts Enoch in charge, apparently as the world high priest in his place. And then Enoch gets raptured not long after that, within I think it's 50 to 100 years of that. And that's when things start to fall apart, because not only is Adam dead, and many of the other patriarchs are starting to die, but the guy he established as high priest is raptured away, and the world starts to fall into chaos within 100 years of that. So Agni becomes Enki because the Canaanites are over here, and the Sumerians are with them. You don't have, the Canaanites wouldn't have been the ones who were exalting Enki because he was a Sethite. It would have been the Sumerians bringing that afterwards. So the Sumerians are going to continue trading with the Hindu civilization. They call it Malelu. There's that U at the end again. And Malelu means the land of or Malelhu or whatever means the land of the flowing rivers. Okay? So again, you have all these rivers flowing down from the Himalayas. That's why it's called the land of flowing rivers. And if you see a wider map of India, all the way through Southeast Asia, and imagine a land bridge that extended to Australia, it's just all these river systems that are flowing down from the Himalayas all over the place and winding everywhere. Tons of space to expand mining and farming and just grow wild fruit and all kinds of crazy stuff because there's just tons of humidity, tons of water. It's just a lush flowing land, and there's spices there. And one of the things it's known for is peacocks. Peacocks come from here, and in Job, Yahweh mentions peacocks to him, which means Job, who is in probably the Aramaean region, is aware of these animals that are mostly down in here, which means there's trade going on there. Solomon trades, and he gets peacocks in his journey, and he apparently sends people from navy he has harbored in Tartessos, which is southern Spain, goes all the way around Africa to India, comes back with spices and peacocks and apes and all kinds of things, and it's a 3-year journey, and you can map that out and go, that's about how long it would take to go around from Tyre to around Africa to India and back. Takes about 3 years. So it talks about them going on this journey for 3 years, bring back all the stuff, and Solomon makes a ton of money off of it. Okay, so we know they're trading with India in Job's day, roughly 1700 BC. Solomon's day, roughly 900 BC, so 600, 700, 800 years later. And then in Ezekiel's day, roughly 600 BC. Okay, so talks about them trading with Rama and Shiva for spices to Tyre. Okay, so this route that goes all the way around Africa, it's a long journey, but it's a big payoff, and they keep doing it. And it's not the only route. There are land routes as well, but those land routes mostly have to go through, again, these Aryans who are going to take their cut and tributary, so it's just a competition on price. Okay, these guys are going to make a lot more money because it's going to be a lot bigger markup because it's going on these trade routes through all these kingdoms and city-states and whatever. So there's going to be a markup along the way. Okay. So anyways, the Zemarites are coming down here. They're bringing with them the priestly system of Enki, which they're claiming to revive. This is the system that they're creating in competition to the new priestly order that Noah's trying to establish through Melchizedek, the Lord of Righteousness, okay, or the King of Righteousness, okay. He's supposed to be the high priest and intermediary of a lower system of priesthood, which is basically patriarchal, based on civilizations and stuff. And the Canaanites, through their mystery and their archaeology and their appeals to occult knowledge, are digging up the original priesthood from down here, which includes in it the creation of Nephilim, which includes in it the deification of ancestors, divination, all this other crazy stuff that God needed to destroy the world for. And they're reviving it and saying this was the original priesthood, so we're reviving it. And the name for Sumer, if you look at, you can go look this up, it's Ki-en-Gir, I think it is, but the name literally seems to mean land of the original priests. That's what they seem to call Sumer. They say it's Sumer because they're naming it after the Zemarites, and the Zemarites have a city over here in Canaan called Sumeru. They're known as Simiru in Egypt and Sumeru in Assyria. They're the Zemarites, and there was once rivers flowing from the Hejaz and from Canaan that connected to the Euphrates River, and that's how they got there. And they were apparently archaeologists and builders who helped build the pyramids and helped. They're migrant workers. They were builders and stuff. And we look at the Mesoamericans, so these are the predecessors to the Mexicans and Guatemalans and the Chinese. Wherever they went, there was advanced archaeology built. You see the Mayan pyramids, that would have been the descendants of the Olmec civilization that came after them. You see the Inca stone building. You see the Chinese civilization. They've got all kinds of pyramids and structures like that, and even reverse pyramids and underground pyramids and weird stuff. Like, these guys were architecturally advanced. They were smart. They knew how to build stuff. They knew how to dig up stuff and read stuff. So they were getting all this architectural and medicinal and astrological and almanac knowledge from before the flood, and that's why they're advancing so much. And you find that Yama or Ham or Yima is accounted with bringing civilization to the world. The rest of these guys are mostly, I mean, imagine this place comes in and they start building cities with astrology and science and all this stuff while everybody else around them is mostly farming and herding cattle. They're the ones who are known for bringing metropolitan civilization back. And they're doing it very fast compared to their relations. And so this is why Ham is so prominent, and he becomes this god who seems to be associated with the word amen. Even though it's going to change its meaning to meaning God's will be done, essentially. That's what amen means. Or agree. It's an affirmation of truth. It seems to be appealed to the name of Ham. He's the high king. In fact, Amenemhat, the pharaoh name, means Ham is at the head. He seems to be the high king and intercessory of the world. And when Noah dies, remember, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, they're a lot less advanced in civilization too. Ham is kicking their butts. He's got this is hundreds of years, okay? So hundreds of years with a guy who's alive. And imagine you've got this guy who's got access to the internet while everybody else is trying to figure out stuff from scratch, okay? Like, he is really going fast and advancing compared to the other people over these hundreds of years. And by the end of it, Noah is basically blessing Shem and Japheth and saying he might be in charge now, but it's not going to last. And he blessed Shem to be over everybody religiously, and he blesses Japheth to be over everybody politically. And that's why we have a world that is now dominated by Aryans, because Aryans literally just means nobles. And nobles means the sons of Gomer is the eldest of Japheth. Ashkenaz is the eldest of Gomer. And they seem to be the ones left in charge to be the nobility of this BMAC civilization. And the closest major civilization of people to the BMAC civilization was the Parthians. And if you go to the Avesta, which is basically the Iranian prehistory and stuff, they call the Parthians the Ashkenaz, I think. It's Ashkenani or something like that. It's Ashkenaz is the name, and it's Ashkenani or something like that is what they call them. So it's very clear that's Ashkenaz, that's the son of Gomer. And then there's 9 tribes of these Aryans or nobles, and one of those tribes is called the Germani, and that's where the Germans come from. Okay, and so the Goths, the Germans, the Iranians, the Parthians, these different people, the Persians, they're all tribes of people descended from Ashkenaz, who's the high nobility of the Aryans, which is ironic because World War III is essentially going to be a fight between the Aryans of the West and the Aryans of the East. It's the Iranians versus the descendants of, the Norse and the Germans and the English. It's Aryans versus Aryans. Okay, so the Zemarites are going to bring Agni here. The Kushites before them are going to bring Indra here. Indra is the same word for Hind. Remember, these are just the names we have are written down and translated by the Aryans afterwards. Hind is the Aryan word for river. Ra, it's literally R-E. If you translate these alphabets over, Hind Ra literally means river Ra. Okay, so when we find Buddha, his version of Indra, his tribe is called the Sakya tribe. They call him Sakra. Okay? They say it's the exact same person as Indra, but he's called Sakra. Why? He's Ra. He's the sun god of the Sakya tribe. Indra is Ra, the sun god of the Indian tribe. And we know the Kushites also worshipped Ra as well as the Mizraimites. That's just their word for sun. Okay? Their word for sun is Ra. The Sumerian word for sun is Utu. The Semitic word for sun is Shamash, and it's right in the Bible. The son of righteousness is the Shemesh or Shamash of righteousness. Just post-Babel name for a sun based on pre-Babel pictographs. That's that. Which one came first, chicken or egg? I don't know. That's just what it is. So Indra is the number one god. It's like something like 2,200 or 1,900 times in the Rig Veda, which is 1,000 hymns. The second most is Agni with like 1,700 times, which makes sense. Indra was the first high god. Agni comes afterward, and he becomes the first ascended god. And it talks about Agni being caught up into the sky because he's Enki or Enoch. Okay? And Indra seems to be the same as Utu, which is based on Yahweh, coming down in the cool of the evening and being the judge of righteousness. He's called the king of the gods, and the other gods were considered sun gods or star gods, and he's the biggest one because the sun is basically the biggest star from Earth's perspective. And when it rises, all the other ones disappear because he's the king of the gods. Okay? Same thing as Ra, same thing as Utu, same thing as Shamash, and then the only god that seems to be above him is a god who is represented in the entire heavens or transcended beyond the heavens, and the heavens is a type of him, and the sun is a type of Ra. That seems to be how they think of it. They don't seem to think the actual sun is the god. They seem to see these patterns in the universe as reflective of the gods in space-time, basically, material reflections of them. And that seems to emerge both in Hindu doctrine and Greek doctrine as soon as they start writing stuff down. So my guess is that's what they always believed, or a version of that, something similar to that. They're not actually worshiping the sun. They're worshiping a god who is represented by the sun symbolically, just like in the Bible, Yahweh comes down in the cool of evening as at the end, in the beginning of the Bible, the Old Testament, and in the end of the Old Testament is called the S-U-N of righteousness, the Shamash of righteousness. Okay? So, again, there's lots of confusion, lots of myths, lots of stuff added to these gods that makes them not Yahweh because of what the things they're saying about him in terms of his character and his deeds and stuff like that, that makes him not Yahweh. And Yahweh reveals the name Yahweh to Moses for the first time, and it's very clear that they're retroacting it into the Bible, and Yahweh tells Moses that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't know him by the name Yahweh. They knew him by the name El Shaddai, which literally means the most lofty or highest El, the highest God. Okay? El is the generic word for God and the high God of the pantheon of the Canaanites. Because it's El just means God. Remember, Babelu means gate of the gods. El just means God generically. Okay? Elohim just seems to be the plural form of that, and it's this, united plural is Elohim. But again, these revelations are given to Moses for the first time. They're not calling him Elohim outside of what Moses is talking about in the third person from the divine perspective. And they're not calling him Yahweh either, even though they're retroactively writing the name of Yahweh in these storylines. Yahweh makes clear that they didn't know him by this name. They knew him as El Shaddai, the highest God. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob knew him by that name. Other people probably knew him by the name Shamash, Utu, or Ra. That seems to be what they called him, because he didn't say, call me this. It's that simple, okay? So when you get to this treaty it's called the Harazada Supalima Treaty, and it's basically, I'm going to probably get these mixed up, but I think Harazada was a Hittite king. Supalima was a Mitanni king. The Mitanni literally means, the Mitanni Naharim or Aram Naharim are literally just the Nahorites. They're the brother of Abraham mixed with the Arameans. And the Hebrews are going up them to get marriage alliances for the first couple hundred years before they're put into slavery. And so the Egyptians named them Mitanni, which means something like marriage alliance. It means the Naharim of the marriage alliances. And this kingdom is basically Arameans, Nahorites, and then the northern section, because there's not a kingdom of Urartu or anything, is the lords of Urarta. They're all united because they never were at war. They didn't get along with them. And it's the Amorites and the Hittites, which are the ones that are trying to take over and dominate and conquer people like Sargon did. And so they're allied in opposition to these two kingdoms that they're surrounded by, and Egypt was an ally of theirs because they were originally friendly to the Jews. And so we find this treaty that is basically after the Jews come out of Egypt and they're in Canaan, and it's somewhere around the 13th century. So imagine around the time of Deborah and Barak and Gideon and that, okay? It's around that time these guys have a treaty, and it's a treaty based on them coming to agreement that the Hittites are going to have the land on this side of the Euphrates, the cities on this side of the Euphrates, and they're going to have the cities on this side of the Euphrates. And they invoke the name of all these gods from the surrounding region, which are going to include gods like Inanna and Utu and Mesopotamian gods. It's also going to include Hittite gods. It's also going to include Aramean gods, and it's also going to include Indian gods. It's going to include Indra, Mitra, and Varuna, and the Asavan twins. Okay, so the Asavan twins seem to be Shem and Japheth. Varuna seems to be Arunus, which is Uranus, which basically was the generic word for the heavens, so it's the god of the heavens. And the idea was that's the god of the heavens. The sun god is the god of the earth. And then Mitra and Indra seem to basically be a designation for that's the sun god of the Hindus, the Indians on the river. And Mitra is the sun god of the Egyptians. It's the Mitzrayim Ra. It's the sun god of the Egyptians. And remember, they're trading with these Hebrews here, and the most prominent clan of the Hebrews is going to be the house of Joseph, who is married into the priesthood of Ra. So it's silly to think that Ra never traveled to these people. It is, but there's multiple Ra's. They have, you remember, the Japhethites are trading from here to here. These guys are trading from here to here, and so they're aware of multiple Ra's. One is the one that the Cushites transferred over here, which is the Indian Ra, Hindra, and one is who the Hebrews transferred over here, which is Mitzrayim's Ra. Okay, so the sun god of Egypt and the sun god of India. That's literally what Indra and Mitra means. Okay, and so in time, Mitra is going to evolve to becoming the god of the covenant. Indra is going to evolve to becoming the god of the storm. And one of the things they're going to say about Indra is how he pierces with his spear the dragon's head. Okay. You literally find this in Job, where it talks about Yahweh pierces the head of Leviathan with his spear, and that seems to be either the astrological sign of Draco and the North Pole, which is kind of like an invisible pole from heaven to earth, is how they would see it. Seems to have had some intersection, and maybe they made the constellation after the thing. But you also have a picture in Egypt of Ra with Set, who's their version of the storm god, who is basically based on Seth, piercing the head of Apophis, which is their serpent of chaos, as he's riding in Ra's bark across the sky. So it's the sun god. So it's the sun god and the storm god piercing the head of the serpent. The sun god and the storm god is basically a bifurcation of Yahweh. One is based on Yahweh appearing to Job in the storm, and one is based on Yahweh coming down to Adam and Eve in the cool of the evening, all bright and shiny like. And this is what you're going to have all over the world. The sun god and the storm god, a heavenly god, another god that's associated with the breath of life, wind, and the spirit. So you're going to have in Aryan cultures, it's going to be masculine. Semitic and Hamitic, Semitic, it's going to be feminine. And in Egyptian influence, it seems to be more of a force. And so it's called Ka to the Egyptians, and then it's going to transfer over all the way to China as Chi. Re is the sun, and Chi is the spirit. In Egypt, Ra is the sun, and Ka is the spirit. But it's very clear that the spirit comes from, or the four winds and the breath of life comes from Ra, according to these coffin inscriptions, okay? So you have an original Kushite people that is going to be overlaid by a Zemarite priesthood and then overlaid by an Aryan priesthood that is probably intermarried in with the descendants of Rama. And that's where Brahma comes from, okay? So we're going to start with the Kushites here. If you look at Kush, this is not what people believe a Kushite is, okay? This is a Dravidian woman, okay? Not all Dravidians are the same. This is a especially dark Dravidian woman. Notice she's got blonde hair, more Aryan features, if you will, in terms of, bone structure and eyes and nose and stuff like that, fine features, but very darker than most African skin, okay? Compare her to this guy who is a lawyer from South Sudan. These are the blackest people in Africa, which is called Kush. This is what their land is called, Kush. These are people who are descended from Kush, but mixed with Aryans, okay? And they probably were mixing with Aryans for hundreds of years before they started to separate by their languages. And those main language division is the Dravidian languages, which she's a Dravidian, and the Indo-Aryan language, which are your, let's see. Which are going to be your more, some of them are brown, some of them are, they're actually whiter, but their complexions are going to be various, forms of lightness. They're going to have the black Sinitic hair because those black Sinites, remember, these people were way more far advanced in farming than the other people, which means they were probably having more kids. And so there are probably more of them in number. And so that's one big part of the reason there's so many Chinese and Indians and stuff like that. But from the Japhethites, they're going to be getting colored eyes and the finer features, okay? And so you see these people here who are not terribly dissimilar to, she's not terribly dissimilar to a Native American. She's not terribly dissimilar to an African, except their hair is much more white people hair, if you will, Caucasian, okay? Because they're a mixture of Africans and Asiatics or Chinese and Japhethites, who are the white boys who become the Turks and the Aryans and all these other people. And so you're going to see a wide variety of skin tones among the Indians, but most of their hair is going to be black. They're going to get that cyanide black hair, and that their hair in a lot of cases is going to be closer to like a Mexican's hair, which is those are the Sumerites coming through. Some of them are going to have more Asiatic eyes, but the original Varna or colors of India was red, brown, black, and white, because as they started to separate and isolate based on language, you started to have much more distinct white, yellow, red, and black people. But black hair tended to be more dominant. The Roma, which these are where the Gypsies are descended from, actually come from India. So they're mixing with Europeans. They're going to have other traits and stuff like that. But they're primarily, see how you can kind of see more Asiatic eyes. You can see lighter skin, but not typically white. You can see darker hair and some, blonder hair and others. These are Gypsies. These are Roma. Okay? They come from India. So you're going to have a lot of these designations, and this variety of colors among the Indians is literally because, we always show the Aryan migration in India, but they're like literally we can't figure out where the dark-skinned Indians come from. Well, yeah, we can. They came from Kush. They came from Kush across here, and then the Sumerians, which across here, we have written accounts of them trading with these people. The Kushites are going to trade with them, and eventually, by the time you get to the age of Brahmanism and stuff, when all these weird ideas are popping up in Greece about theology, those same ideas are going to pop up in India when Kush is ruling over Egypt. So they're getting the same ideas transported over them as they're trading for their spices. But when you look at people describing India, where the Indians come from, they're always like, oh, the Indo-Aryans, the Indo-Aryans, the Indo-Aryans. Why? Because the scholars who are doing this are mostly Aryan. And they're mostly trying to promote the idea of the Aryans being the oldest and the best, the original monotheists, the original oldest religions, blah, blah, blah. And that was largely dominant in the 17th, 18th century, even into the 20th century. And those are the guys who are going to translate most of the Zoroastrian and Vedic literature and stuff like this. And so they're going to focus more on the Indians. And it's eventually the Nazis and Madame Blavatsky and these Russian people, they're going to really draw on this stuff and emphasize the Aryan and blah, blah, blah. But the original people were the black folk. Okay, they were Africans but make sure you understand, they were deeply intermarried with the Aryans before they started to separate because of language. And so the main language divisions are Indo-Aryan and Dravidian, but the people genetically continued to mix in and intermarry, and they're going to have a lot of gods that are going to be the same. Rama, Shiva, or Shiva, so notice you have a V and a B that switched around. This is very important when you understand Shiva is Shiva, and then Krishna is Kush. It's just a word that means the same thing as Kush, okay? The word in Dravidian, if you wanted to say the great or the elder, you would use the word Per. Parama would be the great Rama, okay? You're basically saying, or Master Rama. It's like kind of our chief. It's our head, right? That's the head of all their people. So they would say Parama, okay? The Aryans tended to call their deceased ancestors that they would worship heroes. And so you're going to hear Lord Rama. He's the hero of the Ramayana, okay? It's literally Rama, okay? But V-I-R, remember how B's and V's can transliterate everywhere in the world, everywhere where Japhetite language are. Vir Rama means the hero Rama, whereas pure Rama means Master Rama or the great Rama, okay? There are literally two versions of Rama, and then you're going to have these Kushite languages that are going to put an N at the end of masculine words, and you're going to find this with a lot of different Hindu gods, not just Brahma, and Brahman, okay? So because of different languages, and because of different word meanings for the first Virama, you're going to have a period of probably some 500 to 700 years where the Aryans are calling him Virama and the Dravidians are calling him Pure Rama, and they mean a different thing, but they both are pointing to this great ancestor Rama, okay? That is eventually going to be written down as Brahma. But there's these other people who put the N at the end name, so you're going to have Brahmin. Some are going to call him Brahma, and some are going to call him Brahmin. And he becomes a chief deity. He's one of many, but the chief deities are Indra, because he's king of the gods, Varuna, because he's considered the loftiest of the lofty, or the most high, very similar to El Shaddai in meaning, the heavenly god, who Deus Pater would be another name for him. But when the Greeks meet the Indians, they say or the Zoroastrians, they say they worship Zeus. But then the Greeks adopt Uranus as a titan and Zeus, and they distinguish between the god of the sky and the god of the heavens, in other words, outer space, okay? But it's the lofty god of the transcendent upper abovesies, okay? And then you're going to have, let's see here, Prajapati, where Prajapati literally means Lord of Creatures. And these are, this is an Indian motif of Prajapati, but if you look at the earliest versions of Prajapati, if we can find it, The earliest version of Prajapati from the Harappan pre-flood civilization is this motif right here. And you see a guy sitting here with horns surrounded by animals. Prajapati literally means Lord of Creatures, but by creatures they mean animals, okay? So if you were to Google Lord of Animals, you're going to find this ancient antediluvian god all over the world on different reliefs called the Lord of Animals. And he is usually signified as, or the Master of Animals, Lord of Animals, a guy with his hand between two animals. In other words, he is intermediating between two animal species. It's like he's the priest or the lord or the judge of animals. This is Adam. This is a common motif that's meant to represent Adam. He's the Lord of Animals, okay? So Prajapati literally means Lord of Creatures. He's Adam. But the Aryans are going to have another name for Adam, because remember, this is based on this Harappan Prajapati that is found by the Hamites. And they're eventually going to... The Aryans have a name for Adam, which is Manu, which just means the man. Remember, it's the Canaanite U on the word man. It's the Aryan word man, okay? The man, okay? So when you have the Aryans and the Sumerian priesthoods intersecting and exchanging ideas, whatever they're doing for hundreds of years and not writing it down, they come up with Manu, and then they're going to eventually, hundreds, maybe even thousands of years later, rename Prajapati Shiva. So they're just going to be, we're going to take Manu as the first one. Then they're going to make Manu the guy, they're going to make him Noah and basically make a flood myth about him. And then they're going to take the Lord of Animals, which is Adam, and make him Shiva, who's the son of Rama, the head of the Indian people, the Harappan or Dravidian people. They're all black gods. Prajapati's not. Adam's not. But Prajapati is going to be considered the first god taught by Aditya, which is another sun god. They're going to have a whole bunch of different sun gods, because remember, they're 5 languages, plus there's stuff that they're digging up from before the flood. So they're going to have a bunch of different versions of these sun gods. Aditya is one of them, who teaches Prajapati, and then they're going to say, no, Brahma or Brahman taught Prajapati. And then they're going to say, oh, that's because they're the same one. And then they're going to merge Brahma with Prajapati, and then they're going to say Brahman is the transcendent, invisible Prajapati, like the ineffable one being of Greece, and Brahma is the visible Prajapati, like the demiurge, or it's kind of like God in the word of the Lord, in Judaism, okay? They're taking ideas very similar to the Bible, and then they're taking gods that are based on motifs and ancestors and stuff like that and name changes, and they're just merging them together. And I've just read the Upanishads. I can tell you there's dozens and dozens of different versions of what's what and who's what. And if you read the Greek philosophers, it's the same thing. There's a whole bunch of different versions of what's what, and they're talking about all of them, because it's not a uniform canon. It's just a bunch of different tribal groups with different myths that evolved over many, many centuries. Okay? But the point is they're rooted in Adam, the son of righteousness, the storm god, Yahweh of the storm, Noah, Ham, Enoch. They're just rooted in the same people. And there's not a whole lot of gods besides these, but there's many versions of them because of the distinction of language. And so by the time you get to the era of the Upanishads, the Indians are going to say that there's 33 gods, and so are the Buddhists. The 33 gods is what they're known for. Well, if you just go Adam, Enoch, Ham, Rama, Shiva, there's 5. The sun god and the storm god, there's 6, 7. The heavenly god, there's 8. And then the wind, breath of life god. So Father, Son, Holy Spirit, 2 versions of the sun, because he appears in the sun and the storm. And then these handful of ancestors, it's like a dozen or 11. Handful of languages, triple it. And there's just different versions of them. And you can just go through the meanings of all these, and it's like, oh, this one is associated with the wind and the breath of life. This one's associated with the wind and the expanding heavens. This one's associated with the sun and giving people life. The vivifier, the name means. And it's just very clear they're just a bunch of people's different versions of the Lord as he appeared to Adam, as he appeared to Job, because those are the only known appearances of him before the Tower of Babel. He appeared to Adam and he appeared to Job. We know he appeared to Abraham, but that was low-key until Moses wrote it down. But it was known wider in the pagan world that he appeared to Adam and he appeared to Job, and so he appears apparently in the cool of the evening. That's where you get the sun god. He appears to Job in the storm. That's where you get the storm god from, and he's bifurcated, okay? And so there's not a ton of these. So where do people get the idea that Indians have millions of gods? Simple. Yajnavalkya, one guy. And the one guy is basically saying it. The guy who says it is the guy who invents reincarnation. And because all people are reincarnations of facets or aspects of Brahma, he just takes the world population as his time and he says, oh, there's 33 gods, but there's actually, 33 million. And then it expands to 330 million by the time it's canonized as the idea that there's 33 million gods because everybody's a god because everybody's a facet of Brahma. But in the time of the Vedas and the Upanishads, there's 33 gods because that's how many different versions of these gods are held among the main tribes of the Indo-Aryans, which are a mixture of people from Aryan descent and Brahmin descent, who are going to be lighter skinned and living up in the north. So I'm going to walk through that history a little bit. So you see the Hindu Kush, River of Kush, Himalayas, the abode of Ham. Iran is Aryan, it's just the land of the Aryans. India is the people of the river. As the Aryans are going to continue to grow and expand, they're going to initially migrate up the Indus. These other guys are going to migrate down, and then they're going to find the Ganges River, which is this other river set flowing down to Hindu down into Bangladesh. Okay, that's this river system down to Bangladesh, and that's the other major river. The Aryans who seem to be more crafty, okay, if you're to broadly generalize India, okay, the Aryans are much more crafty, they're better builders. The Hamites were much more scholarly, and so they initially had this thrust to build quite a bit, but they're really just rebuilding for a lot of the things and then discovering a lot of things. But when they get to India, they can't read the language, and the reason is because the language of Egypt would have been, the script of Egypt probably would have been understood by Ham's wife. The script of Sumer would have been understood by Ham himself, but the script of India would have only been understood by the Canaanites. And so Ham couldn't interpret it. And so they spend a lot less time excavating and rebuilding over here because there's a lot less knowledge of what previously existed and motivation to do it. And then, of course, Ham's also older and he's eventually going to die here. And so after that, the Aryans are going to come in and they're much more crafty. And what they're going to realize is that the rivers are much more controllable up at the top towards the Himalayas where, okay, we know how much they're going to flood after, the snows every year. Whereas those waters and muds are going to accumulate down here, and all the way to the present, there's also, some mountains and plateaus down here. All the way to present, flooding is a problem. Flooding and massive mudslides is a problem in India, okay? And so the more stable civilizations are going to be these more Aryan white civilizations up here. And while down here, you're going to have a lot of farming, a lot of spice. And there's the jade trade is going to go through here. The spice trade is going to go through here. But it's mainly some port cities and a lot more rural in general, where this is more of the civilization, the metropolitan civilization and stuff like this. So most people don't know this about India. Obviously, that's changed a lot today. You're going to have major cities in the north. You're going to have bigger cities like, I think Bombay's over here. Bangalore's over here. This is the Kerala region where I've been to a couple times. But this is, more Dravidian, but the Aryans are going to come down here and settle more. And there's obviously over 1 billion people in India, so a lot's developed since then. But back then, the main Indo-Aryan civilizations are going to be up here closer to, you see, Himavant is another way of saying, Himavant is a god that is based on the Himalayas, but it basically means the abode of Ham as well. Laya, I think, is Aryan? I could be wrong. Vant, I think, means expanse of Ham. So maybe that is Aryan, and then Laya is Dravidian. So Himavant and Himalayas are roughly the same thing. You're going to have the Sindhu River over here. Sindhu is Hindu. It's the same thing. You're going to have the Ganges River down here. You see Ganja. It's not just what you smoke. It's a river. And then the first major Indian kingdom to expand and really start to establish itself as a wider empire over the Indo-Aryans is going to be this Kuru kingdom. And they're going to partner with this Pankala kingdom. We don't know if there was wars or whatever. We just know it's going to expand, and it's in this expanse that the Vedic religion is codified, basically. So your Rig Veda is your hymns. That's going to be the oldest thing that gets codified, but they're going to also have rites and rituals of how to perform these sacrifices that get codified, which I think there's like 3 or 4 Vedas, and the Vedas just mean, I think, knowledge. And so the Rig Veda, Rig or Rik means sing, and it's the singing knowledge, and so that is their formula for writing down and preserving the hymns. These hymns are going to tell a lot of stories. A lot of them are just going to be praises and prayers, like the Psalms, and seemingly redundant, and a lot of them are going to contain myths and legends and history, like the Psalms. Okay, several Psalms are going to rehash the time from Abraham down through Moses, and the time from Moses down through the wilderness and stuff like that. And theirs are going to do the same thing. And they're telling stories of Ham and Yama and Yima. What they're not talking about is Shiva, barely mentioned. I don't think it's mentioned at all. Vishnu. When your Hindus today are going to say, oh, your main gods are Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and Brahman is over them all, and everyone's Brahma. Brahma is not mentioned as a god. Brahman is mentioned as a kind of priest. A Brahmin priest is a kind of priest. Brahma is not mentioned as a god, but there is one called Brahmanaspati, and it literally means Lord of the Brahmins. So it seems to be a high priest, okay? And that one is deified. Brahma does not seem to be named as a god once in the Rig Veda. Brahman does not seem to be named once as a god in the Rig Veda. Shiva is not named once as a god in the Rig Veda. Vishnu is, I think, like once or twice in the Rig Veda. And remember, these are like over 1,000 hymns, which are recorded over a period of up to, I think it's like from 1200 to 700, so like 500 years. And they're probably borrowing various myths and legends from the surrounding people as they're expanding and conquering. And so there's going to be a lot of variation in these beliefs. And they're codifying this stuff. And the Brahmin priests, which literally mean the priests of Hero Raman, that's what it is, Hero Rama, they're the ones who are put over the priests as supervisory priests. So think of like archbishops over bishops, okay? The original priesthood are called Angirasis, okay? Angir seems to be another name for Agni. So there's the one with the G switched around. Agni, Angir. Angiras means son of, or of Angir. That's and there's Upanishad statements say that that's a son, and Angirasis means the priests of the son of Agni. Okay, so the Sumerians seem to be trying to extend their priesthood back to Enki, and their descendants are the priests called the Angirasis, but they're eventually, after the Tower of Babel, going to move on, and they're ultimately going to find their way into Polynesia and ultimately into Mexico. They're red-skinned people. We know this. We find flood myths, and there's these myths that basically contain flood stories, creation myths, flood stories, dispersion myths, and then where the colors came from all throughout the world. And the ones in North America talk about a red people who came through, who brought civilization, and they went down to the south. And those are your Mesoamericans, okay? They're more reddish skin, and that's where Native American redskin comes, because they're going to outbreed everybody else because they're farming and all that, and their prominent red skin is going to spread throughout the Americas because of that. They're originally here. Rudra means red Ra. So it seems to be Ra of the red people. Rudra means red Ra. Indra means Ra of the river people. Okay? There's multiple versions of gods with Ra at the end you're going to find. But Rudra was an old god who seems to have once been popular and associated with bulls, and his descendants were called Maruts, or violent ones. And it seems to be associated with the bull of heaven and Nephilim. But he's not the only god associated with bulls, because it's a common motif to have deified ancestors depicted with bull horns. And it seems to be something that goes back to the bull of heaven and Nephilim, and certain deified ancestors would get depicted with bull horns once they're deified. It's like the OG halo, if you will. Okay? So these Kuru kingdoms and the Panchalas, those are the main two, but they're going to see this whole thing all the way down to here, which I believe is Bombay now. And then as they're here, you see this Kosala kingdom is eventually kind of going to be at least culturally absorbed into their system, but not necessarily conquered by them. And then you see all the way over here, Videha, okay? Videha is like the Athens, or this philosophical hub of India. And most of what takes place in the Upanishads, the early Buddhist writings, the early Jain writings, all surrounds Videha. Notice Kosala and Videha here. Here's Kosala here. Videha is overthrown shortly after the period of the Upanishads, say 600 to 500 BCE. So that's why you don't see Videha here, but it once was a kingdom. And the subject of the oldest Upanishad is this guy named Yajnavalkya, who basically invents Brahmanism, and he invents reincarnation, karma, dharma, all that stuff, is trying to, after the fall of the Kurus, it seems like the Kuru kingdom starts to fall apart, these Brahmins, who are basically, imagine like how the Roman Catholics, the Constantinian system, sets up the Pentarchy. Well, the Pentarchy falls apart. Why? Because the Constantinians, which is basically Constantinople, gets taken over by the Muslims piece by piece by piece, and all the pentarchs that they set up, which were basically over priests, so think of like higher priests over these regions of bishops or priests, they get sacked by the Muslims, and so that one disappears, that one disappears, that one disappears, down to Constantinople and Rome arguing over which one of them is the top priest. Okay? That's literally that. Same thing happens here. They have these Brahmin priests over these other priests, and as these kingdoms fall apart, some Brahmins are going to maintain their supervisory priesthood over other priests, and you literally have them describing and discussing this and saying how, like, well, I'm the priest who knows the mysteries of the Rig Veda, and it's literally just all these mysterious parallelisms. Okay, these are basically these sayings that seem to have been originally designed to help them memorize both the songs of the Rig Veda and the texts that tell them how to perform the rites and all this stuff, okay? And these systems are very similar to the kind of idle chatter that is among the Greek philosophers, which are literally trying to argue BS, okay? But what they seem to be originally built for is not to try to prove doctrines, but they seem to be circular reasonings meant to get you to remember what is written, how many syllables are in this, how many lines are in this. It's like a fact-checking system to make sure you're memorizing the thing. And so you're talking about all these patterns and coincidences in all these different ways so that your group of priests or monks or whatever is supposed to memorize these 25 hymns, and you're going to remember these 25 hymns. And as your school is going, you're going to talk about these things every which way and all these patterns and coincidences between them in order to make sure you keep the what is written memorized. They don't have a script. So this is their system that they develop, is all these mnemonic devices which are based around parallelisms, or what we might call etymological and numerological coincidences. And there are things like that in the Bible, like heptads, and there's things like just seeing types and things. You'll hear me talk about types and stuff, and so it's kind of like that, but it seems to be originally for the purpose of memorization, and then it turns into a kind of mysticism on their own, where they're meditating on these parallelisms and coming up with doctrine. And that doctrine, you're going to have these Vedas, which seem to be written down somewhere between 1200 and like 800, maybe 700. So think about a period roughly corresponding to toward the end of the book of Judges, let's say the time of Samson to the time of Josiah, okay? Where they're memorizing these things, and then these people are meditating on these parallelisms, going, hey, these coincidences, maybe they have a divine meaning, and out of that divine meaning of these coincidences, they're going to start to come up with doctrines, which are probably at least partially demonically inspired, probably somewhat just presumptuous. And these doctrines are going to lead to various ways of remembering different systems, and they're varied in all their things because they're based on different traditions, different myths, different hymns they have to memorize, and then what those things actually amount to theologically. And so they're going to have this tradition of meditative things, which is like maybe from 800 to possibly down through 500 as far as that, but there's some overlap and it's not really obvious. And then from these Brahmanas, you're going to get the Upanishads. And the Upanishads are a group of texts that literally means to sit down near. And this is the hearsay of the rationalizations of the doctrines of Brahmanism, which ultimately amount to everything is one and all the gods are Brahman. Reincarnation is what makes everything connected. And, you're going up and down and trying to do this. How do you escape the cycle of reincarnation? Because it seems like living and dying and getting old and falling apart over and over and over again kind of sucks. How do we get out of this? And where's this all going? What's the big picture? And so you can trace all the main doctrines of Hinduism back to one Upanishad, which is called the Brihayanka Upanishad, which is this one. It literally means the forest Upanishad. This one guy named Yajnavalkya is this one sage who comes up with the rationalizations for all these ideas. And you can read in the Upanishad and you can tell he's just making it up, because what he's trying to do, he's in this Videha region, he's trying to convert the king to Brahmanism, because the kingdom that had patronized Brahmanism and made sure the Brahmin priests were making the most money in the sacrificial system, and money is in the form of cattle is their primary source of wealth, but you're getting cattle, ghee, butter, and all this stuff for the sacrifices, and then obviously it's food that you can sell and all this other stuff, okay? It's kind of like the tithe system, similar to that. And so the Kurus who had supported the Brahmins being over all the other priesthoods, which probably were pulled together and codified from a number of different systems, they're falling apart. And so the Brahmins are losing their status as the high priests of the realm, of a very complex, very robust realm that has made many of them rich. And it talks about this in there. It talks about how this guy wants to become a Brahmin, and he says, here, take my 400 cattle and go herd them until there are 1,000 cattle, and then you can become a Brahmin, and I'll teach you, and da-da-da-da, and you can get initiated in the priesthood. They also get stuff donated to them by kings, lands, and cattle, and all kinds of stuff. And so they're rich. The Brahmins are rich. They're the televangelists of their day. And like the televangelists of the day, they literally will say things in the Upanishads like, if you want to make a sacrifice to a rich Brahmin, and that way you'll get more blessing. I'm like, wow, that's exactly like donating money to rich televangelist priests in order to get more financial blessing from God. Exactly the same. False religion's always the same. There's not a whole lot of motives. It's mostly money, sex, and power and influence. But they don't really want to rule people. They just want to get the rules while also get their lust met, while also seeming more spiritual and righteous and holy. That's the goal, right? And this is why you got pedos in the Catholic priesthood, and this is why you have rich guys with multiple wives and all this stuff among the Indians. Well, Yajnavalkya is one of these guys. He's loaded, he's a landholder, a householder, and he's got 2 wives. And he is trying to sell Hinduism to King Ganaka of the Videha, to bring them in, and their goal is this. We sell Brahmanism to you as a system of the gods. And the idea is once that system is established, we sell this idea of we validate you as the Kshatriya class, or the rightful rulers, as designated by the gods. You sell us as the high priests over the other priests and cults and sacrificial performances as designated by the gods. And it's a balanced power here. It's a good thing here. We keep the people stable under you, and you keep the people sacrificing and offering to us. Good system. Like most systems, it's Christian nationalism. It's just Donald Trump and Paula White. It's just 2 BS artists just coming up with a way to do this. But the Vedehas are different because they're very curious. They're very curious. They're going to really want to understand the system. And they actually seem like true believers. And it's because of this that the Vedehas, it's out of this that they are going to adopt Brahmanism. Then their kingdom's going to fall apart in less than a century. And then it's out of the ruling class that had accepted the ideas of Brahmanism that Jainism and Buddhism are going to emerge. One is going to be the Sakya clan. If you see this right here at the base of Nepal, so you see Kosala right here and Sakya right here. So right around here in the north of Adehas is going to be where Buddha or Siddhartha Gautama is from. And the other one is going to be, I'm trying to remember. I can't remember off the top of my head what's the name of the class. It might be the Angas, but I don't remember. I don't think it is. Magadha, I think, is their competitor kingdom. But there's going to be another clan, and there seems to be a disputed two different claims of what clan he's from. But the Buddhists have a lot more written down than the Jains are because they're famous by a much richer, more powerful king, and they memorize a lot more stuff, and they have bigger monasteries and more people memorizing their stuff. Okay. So the point is they're going to come from two princes, both claiming to be descended from kings. Buddha is more likely a king of a land of the Sakya, who is like a smaller kingdom, but it's there seems to be more legit history attached to Buddhism, where Jainism seems to be written down by guys much after the fact, and they give them a mythological origin and all this stuff, and claim how Sakra or Indra basically takes them out of the Brahmin mother's womb and puts them in the Kshatriya mother's womb, to basically as a way of validating divinely that it's not just the Brahmins that know how to ascend to out of reincarnation, it's the Kshatriyas too. And it's actually going to try to move people away from Brahmanism. Okay, so that's kind of the history of where this stems from. I am going to take a break real quick, get some water, and then I'm going to summarize how this history kind of develops between about the 7th century and the 4th century BCE, and then the major ideas that distinguish between Brahmanism, Jainism, and Buddhism, which are not all that different. It's just about Buddhism and Jainism just trying to one-up the Brahmins about, being the highest elevation of who becomes the chief guru to get you out of reincarnation in order for you guys to get us a bunch of money while we stand around being celibate monks that never work and just stare at our belly buttons all day. And the Brahmins are basically doing the same thing, except they want people to carry out sacrifices too, because that's how they make their munties. But they've already BS their way into telling people giving up all your wealth and all this stuff and becoming a wandering monk is the way to escape the cycle of reincarnation and makes you a true Brahmana, knower of Brahma, which makes them look like they're full of crap unless they start becoming wandering monks and giving up their wealth, which they trap themselves into having to do. And that's what creates the monastic movement. So let me get a drink, and I'll be back, and I'll start talking about that. Now, we'll see if this extends to a couple different sessions as we get into Jainism and Buddhism, but I think we can sum it up pretty simply. So, Yajnavalkya. Yajnavalkya is the OG from the Upanishad era sage, okay? Yajnavalkya would be considered the first Hindu philosopher. You see him commonly depicted as wearing orange robes and kind of like a yogish type meditation posed. Nobody knows what he looks like. He was Indo-Aryan. Did he have a beard? Who knows? But he is going to be the first documented to become a wandering mendicant, which are basically just these begging monks who go out into the forest. This is really stupid to have him depicted with these books all around him because they didn't have a written script at the time. So ignore that image. We'll stick with this image that apparently we don't know how to expand. It will not let us expand. I gotta have an image I can expand. We want to look at Yajnavalkya while we're talking crap about him. The chakras. This will do. He's called Yajnavalkya Rishi, and it just means Yajnavalkya the sage. Here we are. Yajnavalkya the sage is this guy who's a Brahmin. He's depicted in this he's got his noble prayer beads and his orange robes. None of this is accredited to him. None of this is in there in the Upanishads. These are traditions that were probably developed afterwards. These guys are using prayer beads to meditate on mantras, which are basically sayings that they're supposed to say over and over again. These are prayers that cause them to meditate and lose focus on what's around them so that they can essentially go into trance-like states and focus on their meditating on self, which is essentially trying to astral project is what they're doing. Okay, nothing that these guys are doing are just chilling and meditating on wisdom. It all has to do with invoking kind of psychedelic demonic experiences to try to awaken the chakras and all this crap that just has to do with basically induced trance states, which is from which they believe that they're getting reincarnation, either from astrally projecting into the realms of the gods or the heavens and hells, or into past lives, and meditating on themselves, because self is Brahman and Brahman is everything, and all the wisdom of the universe is in you. So this is where you get navel gazing from. Everything's within you, so stare at your belly button until you understand the universe. Okay? Now, Yajnavalkya is not originally like this. He's a Brahmin. The Brahmins are not these meditating gurus who are wandering in monks and poor. They're rich priests. Their job is to memorize the Vedas, teach others how to memorize the Vedas and traditions that follow after them, know all this stuff about the Vedas and how they connect together, and then supposedly have these mystical insights about the Vedas. Okay, that's what makes them the Brahmas. That's what makes them the archbishops, if you will, of the Hindu system, of the Vedic system. Okay, and so these guys are going to, out of this tradition, BS and cobble together a new religion, making Brahma the chief god instead of these other gods. Now remember, in the Vedas, Brahma is not the chief god, but they're the Brahmin priests. And so rather than, emerging in this Kuru kingdom, which doesn't exist anymore as the main kingdom, there's still like you still have a smaller Kuru state afterwards. Let's see if I can find this. You see up here this smaller Kuru state, but they had spread this religion, so it'd be like spreading Catholicism all over Europe. And then what happens? The Roman Empire falls apart. And so what happens? Well, Germany's going to go with Luther. Switzerland's going to go with Calvin. Knox is going to take over Scotland. Henry Tudor's penis is going to take over England. And it's the exact same thing. And so you have these Brahmins that are left over, kind of like you have archbishops left over, like the Archbishop of Canterbury was established by the Pope, but they don't fall under the Pope. So why is this bishop, this archbishop there? Well, because we just shrunk down a piece of the Catholic Church for ourselves. And they still see them as parts of the Catholic Church, but protesting the Pope and his practices. That's how they sell themselves. So they're still in the system, but they're in protest. Okay? Well, it's the same thing here. The Kurus established the Brahmins as the high priests of the other priests, the supervisory priests of the other priests. There's like 3 levels beneath them. One's in charge of hymns and chants and memorizing stuff. One's in charge of actual performing hymns and actually singing them. And ones are in charge of actually carrying out the sacrificial rites while carrying out these breathing exercises, which ultimately are going to become yoga. Okay? And so, as this guy's over here in Videha, remember, this kingdom is falling apart. The oldest 2 Upanishads are the Brihadaranyaka, I'm going to mispronounce it, but Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which means the forest the Upanishad, and then the Kanda Yoga Upanishad, which I think the Kandas are a clan, and I believe the Kanda Yoga means something like, yoga means yoking, and it has to do with being united with Brahman. And the Kanda Yogas seem to be the next, and these are 2 parallel traditions that probably are put together over a century or so, but the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is first. And it also is the start of the tradition of these wandering monks, and it's very significant in Hindu tradition. Now, we know from the fact that both the Jains and the Buddhists, who seem to come between the 5th century and the 4th century, 6th and 5th century, I think, maybe 500s and 400s. There's a dispute of about 80 years of when they originated, but they both mention Brahma, and they both mention Brahmins as priests. No one mentions Brahman as a god. It's an idea that they're trying to sell, because the idea of selling Brahman as the most high god and all the other gods as being kind of like avatars or incarnations of him is how they're trying to sell the religion so as to keep themselves at the top. If we're the Brahmanas, the knowers of Brahman, as means of, so we're of Brahman, we're the priests of Brahman, Brahmanas, and Brahman is the most high god, then we're the ones who should be over whatever existing religions and cults of priesthoods you have, as the ones who mystically bind them all together. And they bind them all together by saying that everything is Brahman, and it's a whole bunch of different nonsensical, illogical, circular reasoning, parallelism proofs that they use that are not consistent with each other, but they're meant to be these ways to BS into saying, oh, actually, yeah, that god is this god, so that they can reorganize existing hierarchies wherever they go and put themselves at the top. It's literally what Sargon does in Akkadian. It's literally what the Egyptians from Thebes do when they overthrow the Hyksos or the Hebrews. It's what the Babylonians do when they overthrow the Akkadians, or the Amorites do when they overthrow the Akkadians. It's just reorganization of the pantheons, putting the god or ancestor or tradition that they're associated with on top. You guys can be in it. You can have your cults to your gods, but remember, that god is subordinate to this god, and this god's higher, and so our priesthood is the highest. And they're literally saying stuff like, when they get people to talk them into making them the leaders, I should make as much money as all the priests underneath me are paid. So it'd be like if you have a sales force and some guy makes himself the sales manager of the sales force, and he gets equal commissions to everybody else. Everybody underneath him. So half of all the commissions go to him, while the other guys, he's got 10 guys underneath him, they're making 10% of what he's making. It's a good system. Imagine if you have whole churches tithing to Benny Hinn, Paula White, and all the greats, all the great wise teachers of our era, and then some guy shows up and he's just like, I'm the apostle Bill Johnson, and I get 10%, I get equal tithes to all of them. So everybody else is tithing double, and he gets as much tithes as everybody underneath him. That's the NAR for you. That's the archbishops for you. And that's Brahmanism for you. They're all the exact same thing. It's about making more money. So the Brahmins are peddling their wares to other kings. One of them, in the Chandogya Upanishad, which is the second oldest one, talks about this guy who's literally homeless. He's got a child bride, which is basically somebody who's his betrothed, but she's not his. She's like a wife. She's his, but she's not marrying age yet. She's a child's bride. And so he's literally begging for beads to feed him and her. And he's like, if only I could get some food, then I could make some wealth. And he's like, I know. He doesn't even say that he's a Brahmin before that. So some of these guys could literally just be guys who know some stuff and are just making this up. He literally is like, I know, I should talk the king of the region I'm in to letting me be the one in charge of the sacrifices. And he goes to these other priests who are performing sacrifices. Because remember, these sacrificial systems pre-existed the Brahmins. They were just canonized as over the other priesthoods under the Kurus, which was a substantial period of time. But it's kind of like how you have guys like Job and Noah and all these guys doing sacrifices before the Levitical priesthood comes along. Now imagine the Levitical priesthood comes along and says, we're the only ones who could do sacrifices. Well, that wasn't true in the Levitical system because you had prophets doing sacrifices who weren't Levitical priests. But imagine they came in and said, well, we're in charge of doing the sacrifice and telling you how to do it. And also, whoever gives an offering to you to do a sacrifice, and also that feeds you and your household, they have to give equal amounts to us. Money! That's how you do it. And so, this guy literally goes to these other priests, and he just says, if you do this offering to Indra without knowing Indra, your head's going to fall off. And he's literally basically warning them, if you do this stuff not knowing what you're doing, you're going to be judged by the gods and you're going to be destroyed. And of course they don't know what they're doing because they're just carrying out stuff that was either taught to them by the Brahmins or in their traditions. They don't know the mystical meaning of this stuff. They're just doing this by rote, right? And they're all just taught a piece of it. It's the Brahmins who are taught the whole thing. See how they have the system? You know some stuff, you know other stuff, but only we know the whole thing. and that was their way of controlling and keeping themselves at the top. But it was also a practical means of dividing up who memorizes what, so it stays in a tradition. Okay, the idea is that you break up who memorizes what, and then the Brahmins have access to the whole because they supervise a bunch of different priestly groups who have the chunks of the Vedas memorized, and they're the ones who knows them. Because why? They're the only ones with the library card. Okay, it's a great system. Anyways, this guy just tells all these people this is the real thing, and he just gives these weird parallelisms about how everything's Brahmin and how this is that and this is that, and you can just read these things and they're just nonsensical. You're just like, oh, that's an interesting coincidence. How does that make what you're saying true? It doesn't. Their sense of logic is insane, but these are guys who are just taught to do and say things by rote, and their entire lifestyle is basically just doing things through memorization without understanding what they're doing, kind of like the Levitical priesthood. And then these guys come along with these mystical means of remembering and fact-checking and making sure these guys keep this stuff standard. And then out of these things that they're used to hearing, which are meant to be supervisory, again, circular reasoning parallelisms that are meant to fact-check whether they're remembering it properly. Again, you just read through this stuff and it's syllables, lines, etymology of words, numerological coincidences, just a bunch of stuff it's meant for memorizing. These guys then turn that knowledge into means of making assertions about what is what theologically. There is no logical connection between the parallelisms and what they're asserting theologically, and it is very clear that everything is derivative of what is originally said by Yajnavalkya, which he is going to claim was taught to him by this guy named, I think, Ganaka. No, it's King Ganaka, Ganga. There's two guys. So there's a guy like 10 generations earlier, and he is going to count this genealogical, he calls it a stem, which goes all the way back to Aditya to Prajapati or Brahman to Prajapati, okay? First of all, it's one guy. These are supposedly things that are kept by his disciples, okay? It's one guy, and there's two different sayings of teachings that he gave to one of his two wives before he leaves off in the forest to become a mystic. And he's giving the genealogy tree, basically saying this is how we know this came from God originally, and it was passed down and passed down and passed down. It was the original meaning, mystical meaning of the teaching, not just something I'm making up, okay? And the genealogies don't even match. There's like 3 or 4 of them. They don't even match. They're similar, but they don't even match. They range from, I think, between like 48 and 62 generations. Okay? But if you understand that Brahman is Rama and Prajapati is Adam, and you take these genealogies and then you put them side by side with the genealogies of Christ in Matthew and Luke, going all the way back to Adam and going all the way back to the time of Noah, you can actually figure out that the range of numbers is so similar that you can figure out when Yajnavalkya lives, which is basically within a century of the destruction of Jerusalem, probably before that. So he's literally in the era of like Solon and Thales of Greece. Pythagoras is next generation from them, coming up with these ideas that are almost identical, which seems to come through Pythagoras and eke down to the philosophers in India. And he gets it from going to Egypt and Babylon. So you can crunch the math and figure out why are these guys coming up with very similar ideas to what is going on in Egypt and being transmitted to the Greeks at the same time, because the Kushites, who are related to the Dravidians and trade with them across the Indian Ocean, have taken over Egypt at this time. And it's in the capital of Sais, which is where King Necho and his heirs rule from, that Solon and Thales and Pythagoras are going to go to get their Egyptian knowledge. And so these mysteries and this idea that all gods are this and it's all this and it's all, primordially from this, seems to be originally Egyptian, and then some of these are even older and come from Sumer. But the more advanced theological beliefs come from Egypt. We just don't have a clear, here's where the Egyptians wrote this down and taught it to these people. They seem to have taught it orally to reputable priests and kings and people like that around who would visit them. Why? Because their priesthood has fallen apart because their kingdom is getting sacked by Assyria. And they have puppet kings ruling over them now. And so they're not long for the power they once held with the pharaohs. And so they're marketing their wares to other people as means of saying, we have the mystical knowledge and we're the oldest people. And you can get this from Solon via Plato, where it's very clear that they're trying to convince them that they had the original OG religious and spiritual and historical knowledge from before the flood. And that's where the story of Atlantis comes from, as a means of the Egyptians proving that they have the oldest original OG knowledge, okay? Well, they're clearly spreading this knowledge to the Greeks and the Indians, and there's trade that goes all the way around Africa, which makes sense because their gods are mixing and mingling, and you're finding names that are similar across, like Hephaestus is Tavashter, Deus Pater is Father Zeus. It's clear that they're trading gods back and forth, both through this land route that is going to be going on forever, and then also through the sea route, which is basically going around from, think a loop from Tyre all the way around to India and back, okay? So it's because they're borrowing these ideas, and obviously these guys aren't going to give cred and be like, actually, this came in through this port, through this trader and this merchant, and you got it from the Egyptian priests. No, they're going to be like, because I'm so wise and got it from God himself and it was passed down through 48 generations from the original ancestor, that is the Lord of creatures, who we see on what we know are the oldest reliefs that were dug up after the flood. They do believe in a flood, they just believe Manu is Noah. Okay, so they're making Adam and Noah merged. And Yajnavalkya is the only one of all the Upanishads who attempts to claim this is a tracing back to the original. Again, Brahman or Prajapati. It's Aditya to Prajapati or Brahman to Prajapati, so it's like saying basically Rama is elevated to in the place of Yahweh, or Aditya, which is another sun god like Yahweh, or like the son of righteousness. It's them down to Prajapati, Lord of creatures, or Adam, and then all the way down to them. But the number of genealogies basically looks like there's two different versions of this. One traces back to the time of Rama, which is where Brahman makes sense, and then one traces back to the time of Adam, which is where Prajapati makes sense. And then it is Yajnavalkya who first tries to explain how, maybe it's not him who says Brahma and Brahman are, kind of like the ineffable and the effable. It's kind of like the ineffable one being in the Logos in the Greek theology, but it's very similar. It's like it's in the Chattanooga Upanishad or the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, I'm pretty sure. And these would have been, again, the earliest. Yajnavalkya himself seems to live in the 7th century. The Upanishads seem to be codified and canonized by like the 5th century. So this time of the 5th century, when it's all like this, notice you see the Achaemenid Empire. It's around this time that the Persians are going to take over the Indus Valley and pretty much rule, not heavy-handedly, not with huge administration in the area, but to this side of the Indus River. They are going to have some rule on the other side, and then Alexander the Great's going to try to conquer it, and he's not going to be successful, but set up some administration behind him. And then Maryagupta is going to take over the whole thing and have an empire later. Okay, so it's basically between the time. Imagine the time that Pharaoh Necho is over the Egyptians, because the Assyrians have sacked the Egyptians, and now they put these Kushite monarchs over Egypt, and they're their allies. Remember, he's going to go try to help Egypt against Babylon and kill King Josiah along the way. So it's from that time period, little before that, I would say, to the time period of Cyrus and Cambyses and these guys taking over down to Darius the Great, who helps them finish rebuilding the temple. Okay, very clear window that is corresponding with the end of the Hebrew canon, with the kind of the falling apart of Egypt as a significant power, and Assyria and Babylon to follow. So as the stuff is falling apart, and then Persia now rules over it all, they basically rule over everything from here to Egypt. And what you have emerge on the outskirts of Persia's domain is reincarnation and something like Brahmanism, where everything is one and they're all basically avatars of one god or reincarnations of one god, all around the Persian Empire, including up in the northeast. The Taoists are going to emerge with a version of this. While within the Roman Empire, you have something that seems to be a blend, or within the Persian Empire, you have something that seems to be a blend of Judaism and Zoroastrianism, which involves a final resurrection of the dead for judgment rather than reincarnation. Okay? All these things seem to emerge in tandem. Yajnavalkya seems to be, again, we can't nail this down with exact precision, but he seems to be the oldest recorded version. After him, probably Pythagoras, but they're probably within 50 years of each other. Okay, it's not a long time. And the source seems to be Egypt and their rites of, getting the spirit of this guy to go into this god and stuff like that. That seems to be the source of it. Okay? Yajnavalkya is Mr. I don't practice what I preach at all. And that's how he ends up being the first monk. Okay? So Yajnavalkya has 2 wives, a lot of money, he is wealthy, and he is considered, he actually, in a contest over who's the wisest one of the sages or rishis or brahmanas, he's going to claim to be the wisest. King Ganaka of the Videhas is trying to decide whether or not to adopt Brahmanism as a system in his kingdom. And he is going to go to a group of sages who meet together and discuss philosophy in Videhas. Remember, Videhas is like Athens, where a bunch of philosophers come and debate and discuss their ideas and, try to quibble over who's the smartest and come up with wise sayings that they're like, oh, I agree, even though their things are opposite. Okay? Exact same thing happens among Greek philosophers. BS artists mixed with logicians, mixed with people who genuinely want to know, mixed with people who want to look smart. And it's basically the exact same thing as the different martial artists who are based in Qi, which is based in Taoism, proving their prowess in fighting in martial arts. These guys are proving their prowess in rhetoric. Sayings, basically. It's the same thing. Oh, he's wise. I should be his follower and give him free money to get as wise as him or as strong as him, right? It's the exact same thing. And so these guys are all meeting in their normal place where they're going to meet and banter. And King Videhas comes and he says, I got 1,000 cattle and 4 patas of gold, or whatever, how much gold this is, for whichever one of you is the wisest. Because he wants to know from the wisest guy who knows the most stuff to question him to decide if they're going to have Brahmanism as their national religion within his kingdom. Okay? And Yajnavalkya says, I'll take those cattle. That would be me. And everybody else looks at him and they're like, who does this guy think he is? He's like, I'm smarter than all y'all. And he's like, I'm not actually saying I'm smarter than you guys. I just want the cattle. He's just a money grubbing fool. Okay? He's Benny Hinn. He's Creflo Dollar. And he basically is just like, I just want the cattle and the goat. So the others are just like, you're not the wisest. And he's like, well, I'm welcome. You guys are welcome to prove that I'm less wise than you. Go ahead. But I just did this because I wanted the cattle and the gold. So they all line up to question him with these questions that are supposed to prove that he's not the wisest. And they just have all these different discourses where people are trying to ask him things about, the primordial elements of the universe, where such and such gods come from, how many gods are there in the Vedas, how many this, that, and the other thing are there in the Vedas, and why, and how they connect together. And it's really testing knowledge that would have been common to the Brahmanas and stuff that they would mystically meditate on to connect the dots and memorize the stuff. That's usually what Brahmanas are doing. They're giving you mystical knowledge that really is mnemonic devices that have to do with the information contained in the Vedas. They're not really giving you doctrine based in the Vedas. Because again, the Vedas are just a bunch of hymns to a bunch of different gods in a pantheistic system that is not really clearly organized and established. There's multiple different gods claiming to be the most high in this system, and it doesn't make any sense. And the Brahmins have somewhat organized it into a system, but it's not really even a clear pantheon, because they've been cobbling together over hundreds of years in an expanded kingdom, and then that kingdom fell apart, and it's not really an established canon of doctrine because it never came from original one source. It's that simple. Okay? Imagine if like all the apostles went and spread around and wrote different writings, and someone came and cobbled them together with writings of their disciples that were derivative, and then one day they were just like, let's try to put this into a religion with a systematic theology. You can't figure out what because you don't have a unified group of people that wrote the stuff in the first place. Well, that's what this is, only with a bunch of different gods that are overlapping and redundant versions of the same gods. Okay? So, and it's not even all of them, because again, when we learn stuff about later Hinduism, Buddhism, and Brahmanism, it's clear there is a lot more different gods than the gods that are in the Rig Veda. That's just the gods within their domain, okay? So, Yajnavalkya is basically like giving them all these answers, and the understanding of his answers is basically saying like he mic drops on all these people. And like one of them is like this woman who's just like, she's a wise woman. There's wise women too. And she's asking like, who made this god? Who made this god? Who made this god? Well, then who made Brahman? And he goes to the top and he goes, don't question beyond that or your head will fall off. And that's like a mic drop. Why? He basically said in this authoritative way, you're getting too big for your britches, woman, because you're asking who made God. And he hasn't even established yet that Brahman is the one true God, that all gods are Brahman. Okay? Now, in the context of this Bridyanka Hanka, I'm just pronouncing it, but this Forest Upanishad, there's literally like, they all start with like one mystical thing. Like the Chanda Yoga Upanishad starts with the idea of Om and all the things that have to do with the syllable Om and how this represents Brahman. Why are they coming up with Om representing Brahman? Because Om is their version of the word Amen. Okay? And just like people will say Amen sometimes at the beginning, sometimes at the end of different psalms and stuff like this, Om is their version of Amen. And Om, they're trying to prove that Om means Brahman because Brahman is not in the Rig Veda, but Om is all over it. It's used in all the rituals and rites and stuff. And they say, so if Om is Brahman, then there's proof that Brahman is the OG God. It's not a bad ruse, because if Om and Yam and Amino and Amen are based on Ham, and one of the ways of saying the great Brahma or the hero Brahma is Brahman, and Ham is Amun in Egyptian, Brahman could be the great Amun or the great Ham, and Brahma could be the hero Ham versus the hero Rama. Amun and Rama, okay? Yama and Rama. It's so close that you could make the argument. And so these people may actually be making the argument from a genuine confusion between Ham and Rama. I mean, they're not that far off syllabically, right? And with a confusion of languages, that might be the original basis for somebody making this. We just don't have that documented. And so when they're saying Om is Brahman, and it is possible that Amen, Amino, and Amun and Yam are literally based on Ham. It's based on an invocation of his name in their prayers that spread all over the Hamitic world centuries before the Tower of Babel. And so after the Tower of Babel, they're just like, oh, that just means God's will be done, or I agree with like a divine invocation. And so that just becomes a generic term for, affirming the godly thing that's said in the psalm or the invocation or the imprecatory test that's going on in the book of Deuteronomy or Leviticus or whatever. That could be. It very well could be. It makes sense to me that it is. We don't have proof that it is. All this stuff could be connected based on knowledge that actually has a basis in history, but that history is confused. But they all start out with something mystical like this. The Forest Upanishad starts out with this explanation of a horse that is sacrificed as if it represents creation. Okay? You have this other god named Purusha, which he's going to explain. Purusha means, I want to say it's like the breath of a person or something like that, or no, it's the body of the ashes or whatever. And this is where the Yuga cycle comes from, about this cyclical destruction and reincarnation of the universe itself, within which people are destroyed and reincarnated. Because he's going to make this argument that the word Purusha, which is a name for a god that has a myth of having been destroyed, and this destroyed body became the elements of the universe and the material creation, which is the Tiamat myth. It's just a version of the Tiamat myth. He's going to explain how that the etymology of the word proves that it's based on the destruction of the ashes of the previous universe that this person is made of, and therefore when they're destroyed, a new universe is. In other words, the god is made up of the ashes of the previous universe, and then they're destroyed to become the next universe. Okay, it's interesting stuff. I'm not going to lie. From a person who studies mythology and ideas and etymology, the stuff they come out. The stuff they come up with is genuinely intelligent. It's genuinely interesting logically. It's just clearly BS, because they'll literally do stuff like, this is what the etymology means, but this word is actually close to that word, and that's what the word really means. But, the gods just love mystery, and that's why it doesn't actually break down to the etymology we're saying. Like, they're very clearly BSing, but there's also etymological rationalizations that are not that dissimilar than me looking at the Bible and going, oh, do you know this guy's name means this? And if you tell this story in this way and you understand that this guy's name means this and this guy's name means this, it teaches you something that parallels to this prophecy over here. It's that kind of stuff that they're doing with the Rig Veda, but they will fudge it whenever they want to and adjust the etymology and just say, oh, gods love mystery. There's multiple sayings that they're going to come up with that say that. Oh, the gods love mystery, because they know they're just BSing it. Okay? But as BS artists, they are some of the best. And this is why you're going to have Yajnavalkya. It's going to talk about this horse sacrifice. And this horse sacrifice is a big deal, because in the Aryan system that they're promoted, and this goes way back to the Indo-Aryans, probably like 500 years before this guy, the way these kings would designate that the gods want them to go expand their domain is they would take a white horse, they would let that horse just wander on its own through various villages and stuff, and if the horse came back, they would say, this is a sign from the gods that everywhere where this horse has wandered and come back from, so everyone who can seeing the horse, I'm supposed to rule over that. And then they would sacrifice the horse as a way of confirming and accepting their rule over this, and by that they would go try to expand their kingdom. Apparently a certain amount of people bought this, and so they're starting, all these Upanishads would start with just this mystical thing, and here's the mystical meaning behind this thing. So there's kind of a similarity between Purusha and this horse thing, almost. And then it's going to start with, it's going to give you 3 different creation myths. And one makes water, like the primordial water is basically the origin of everything, which is the exact same thing as the Egyptian story of where the first gods come from. One makes a god named Self, which is meant to be your higher self, which is ultimately what Brahman becomes, the original god. One makes Prajapati, the original god. And it just leaves these hanging. Here's 3 different creation myths. It just leaves them hanging, okay? They don't logically or mythologically comport to being anything but 3 different creation myths from 3 different people. You cannot look at these just by themselves and say, oh, they're reflections of one another. No, they're 3 different creation myths from 3 different belief systems. It's very clear. One accounts Prajapati, which is the Lord of Animals, which would have been the oldest god if you're counting iconography in India. One is the water, which is the original primordial belief system of the Egyptians, which the Kushites probably shared. And third is Self, which is the basis for the Brahmanism that these guys are trying to promote. And the reason it just gives them all and leaves them hanging is because, just like the horse is kind of like Purusha, Yajnavalkya is going to come in after this and take this base material and connect the dots through these mysteries to try to explain how they're all saying the same thing, even though they're saying things that in some cases are opposite. Like one of them makes death the first god. Yama is death, Yama is Ham. That would make sense that Ham would be one of their oldest gods, okay? So death is Yama, death is the first god, and their rationale for why death is the first god is because all things are created to be consumed. Law of thermodynamics, the world is decomposing and breaking down, therefore death is the assumed god, everything is made to be consumed. Death is the primary deity. It just so happens that death is associated with Ham, and Ham is their oldest forefather. Makes sense, okay? But then it's going to talk about how Ham created water as his body or something like that. Well, another one is going to say the primordial waters pre-existed everything, and the first god it created was, I believe, Prajapati, but it may have been Brahman. I get these mixed up. But the point is it's not even Yama. So it's like, so the water created this, and this guy created water. Those are two different things. And then self is just going to be, here's this guy who, just came into being, and he's like human shaped, and he's got a body, but he's the lone god, and he's all by himself, which is why he's called self. And this is basically the exact same idea as the Greek monad. And it's going to say how self was afraid because he was all alone. And then he reasoned to himself, wait a minute, I have nothing to be afraid of. I'm all alone. Like, this is how their Most High God would probably think, right? Like, their Most High God is literally just figuring out stuff as he goes. And then self is going to basically be like, you know what? I want a wife because I don't like being alone. And then he realized how immature it is to be afraid of being alone. And so he's like, fine, I just want a wife because I want a wife. And he creates a wife out of himself. So it means he's originally hermaphrodite, which is actually something that's all over Greek mythology. And then he divides himself into his husband and wife. And then these two keep shape-shifting into different pairs of animals from which supposedly all the animals come from. So this is self. He's just called self. And then eventually I think it equates self with Brahma or Brahman. Okay? You have these weird, distinct creation myths. And then the next thing you have is basically Yajnavalkya telling one of his wives, I think her name is Aditi, I got to go become a forest monk. And so before I go, I want you to know this knowledge. Here's this mystery knowledge about blah, blah, blah. Who cares, who cares, who cares? And then here's the stem. This is the genealogical root of the stuff back to Brahman or Aditya. Okay? Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Begs the question, why does he have to go become a forest monk? Well, keep reading, and it's going to tell you the story about how he claimed to be the wisest guy in order to get this cattle and stuff. He paints himself into a corner where he's stuck being a wandering monk. Otherwise, he's really going to upset this king, and it's really obvious to see what he did if you're not holding any reverence for this material and just looking at it as a conscientious onlooker who knows how religious leaders tend to BS stuff. Okay? So if I'm looking at this guy and I see Benny Hinn waving that coat around, and I'm not thinking, well, touch not the Lord's anointed, I don't want to get struck down by lightning, I'm going to be a little bit more skeptical about what he's saying. So here's what he does. Yajnavalkya answers all these questions, mic drops on all these people, and then he pulls a Jesus, and he's like, now let me ask you something. And the thing he asks him is like, how does a tree come back to life, grow out of the ground, if it's pulled up by the roots? And don't say, and he's using this metaphorically from, how could a human be reincarnated? How could a human come back? Okay? So reincarnated is obviously a doctrine that's kind of floating around, but it's not an established doctrine because all the other wise men around him, they don't know what he's talking about. And he's like, and you can't say by the seed, because he's comparing a tree to a man. He starts out by comparing a tree and its bark to a man and his skin and all this stuff. And then he's saying, so let me ask you this. If a tree is pulled up by the roots, how can it grow again? And you can't say by the seed because it's been pulled up by the roots, and a dead man can't produce kids. Because the original version of reincarnation seems to be, and this exists in forms of Kabbalistic Judaism as well, is the idea that you're reborn through your kids. Maybe skip a generation or whatever, but you're reborn through your kids. And so it's like, if I kill a man, how can I, in other words, if he dies childless, how can he be reborn? Because the idea is like, if your sons die, you're blotted out from the book of life. This is a very old mystical idea from, the Semites, okay? And nobody has an answer for his question. And he basically insinuates reincarnation. In other words, they go to the gods, and the god puts their soul substance back in a new womb, and they get a new body. Okay? He insinuates it. He doesn't flat out teach it, but he insinuates it, and he's like, how can this happen? No answer, mic drop. And that's the end of everyone questioning him, okay? There's no conclusion, therefore he was determined the wisest. They're just saying this is how these dialogues end, okay? So then the king turns to him, and basically he literally pulls a Jesus. It's like they're questioning him, trying to trip him up. He answers all the questions perfectly, and then he asks them a question, and they are silent. It's exactly like Jesus. In fact, when I read this stuff, and I read Buddha, and I read the discourses and the narratives about Buddha and about guys like this, and then you read the Gospels and how Jesus is sending out disciples who are basically have nothing but the food they're given, and how they ask him questions and answer questions, and then how the Mishnah and the Talmud are with teachers memorizing dialogues and discourses of teachers about the law. It is so much like this. It's very clear, like that's how the ancient world was. It wasn't a bunch of scholars saying it is written, it is written, it is written. Occasionally it is. It was these dialogues and discourses, and the wise or the wannabe wise would just listen to these dialogues, and they would write down the things, and out of this supposed wisdom, more concrete authoritative ideas would form. It's among the Hindus, it's among the Jews, it's among the Greeks. It's very apparent that it's everywhere. This is how people thought and reasoned. This is the wise coming together in the square to rhetorically debate, and then they're not as combative. It's not like Jay Dyer, like just calling someone an idiot and talking over him over and over again. It's actually wise, clever things they're saying, interesting, clever things they're saying, and it's out of this that people are deriving knowledge that is authoritative on the basis of the wisdom of the people who are saying it, presumed to have gone back to the gods, or in the case of the Jews, the scriptures, and then held as authoritative on the basis of traditions based on the reverence for these guys' wisdom, which is the exact same thing with the rabbis among the Jews. So what the point I'm making is that not that Jesus is copying these guys, but the rabbinical tradition seems to. The rabbinical tradition seems to copy these traditions a lot, and the traditions of the Greek philosophers a lot, which questions which is the original, or was this a common way of doing things among priests and teachers and stuff? I don't know. But they're so much alike. It's like if you were to read the Upanishads or the Pali Canon about Buddha and his discourses and what his disciples said, and then the Talmud, and then go back and read the Gospels, I think it paints a much different picture of how Jesus is interacting with people, and how it doesn't change the gospel message, it doesn't change the narrative, but it puts you in a much different perspective, or the mode of how discourse and disagreement and dialogue worked back then, and how people received things as onlookers. And that's what Upanishad means. It means sitting down near. In other words, I've seen or heard this discourse or this dialogue, and all Plato's writings are written like that too. So anyways, Yajnavalkya, the Benny Hinn of the Hindu world, is going to turn to the king. He's won. He's proven he's the wisest. He gets 1,000 cattle and four pounds of gold. He's in it for the money. Don't stop me from dreaming, he said. I can have a $65 million plane if I want to. That's faith, baby. And the king is like, hey, are you here for subtle sayings? In other words, the wise discourse? Or are you just here for the money? Remember, this king is trying to decide if he wants to have Brahmanism in his kingdom. And this guy's just proven that he's the wisest Brahmin. And so if that guy establishes Brahmanism in his kingdom, who's going to be the archbishop over it is this guy. He's in a good place to become the Pope of this guy's this Constantine's dominion, and the Vedic kingdom is pretty substantial at that time. And so he says both. I'm not just here for the money, I'm here for the wisdom too. Both. Okay? He gives very confident answers and then fails to realize what he's saying after he says it. I'm here for the money and for the wisdom. And so he says to the king, tell me what you've heard. In other words, you tell me what other wise Brahmanas have told you, and I'll verify it, whether it's true or BS. That's what he's saying to the king. Tell me what you've heard. And what the pattern is for the Brahmanas, remember, they can take these Vedas and they can create these circular reasoning paradigms because they've been doing this for centuries. This is their way of constructing mnemonic devices to establish the standard of what is in the Vedas, okay? And then meditating on these things, they can establish other mystical presuppositions or suppositions about the theological meaning of these things and the basis of these patterns and mysticism, the same way we might dabble in typology, but some of that comes out with stupid ideas and some of that comes out with ideas that conform to Scripture because only the Spirit can really reveal these things. Well, these guys take it a step further and they're trying to establish something that makes them basically the true priests of the Most High God, which in the Vedic system they were not. The true priests of the whole Most High God in the Vedic system were Agni and the Angarasis, who are the priests in heaven, and they were just meant to be the reflection of them on earth. Okay, this is where Brahman and Brahma comes in. This is these ideas of there being an invisible heavenly and a visible spiritual, not unlike the Jewish temple being in heaven and on earth. Okay, and Agni served God in heaven. He's kind of like Christ as our high priest in heaven. And these guys are serving on earth, kind of like the Pope and the archbishops in Catholicism. They're remarkably similar systems. Agni is based on Enki, who is taken up into heaven, and ours is based on Christ, who is taken up into heaven. In fact, it's so similar, it's so bizarre that these people weren't super into Christ when they heard about him. It's really bizarre. They actually the Brahmanas actually kill the Apostle Thomas. Okay? They're like, that's really interesting, and that's kind of almost exactly like this guy actually did, and you guys witnessed him doing the exact same thing on which we based the theological authority that we preach throughout India. That's really interesting. Hey, I need you to stop horning in on our turf or we're going to kill you. And then they kill him. Okay? But these guys are about the Montes. And they're about the accolades, and they're about the ladies, and sometimes the boys. But mostly they're hetero. Okay, we'll get into that a little bit more with Jainism and Buddhism. Yajnavalkya is going to basically tell this guy, what have you heard? And one of the ways the Brahmins affirm all other Brahmanism and the idea that everything is Brahman is by using these mystical rhetorical devices as a way of saying, well, yeah, what they said is true, and here's why, and just mangle it into gobbledygook. But they just keep arriving at that's because everything's Brahman. That's because Brahman is all gods and blah, blah, blah. And so here's these things that are both true and untrue. Here's these seemingly contradictory things that are actually both true, and here's the mystical reason why. Now, another master of doing this is Parmenides, who is in Plato, and he literally takes this guy and he walks him through all these reasons, all these attributes of God cannot be, and then walks them through the exact same attributes and says how they must be, as a way of saying all truth is relative. Parmenides' system of the monad, and everybody being part of the monad, and all perspectives being, from a certain perspective, true, is identical to what these guys are coming up with related to Brahmanism. And Parmenides, as an old man, taught Socrates in his youth, and Parmenides is very close to Yajnavalkya. He's a little younger than Pythagoras. And Socrates is very close to Buddha. In fact, you could almost parallel the tradition from Pythagoras down through Socrates and the tradition from Yajnavalkya down through Buddha. And you can tell they're like the same thing happening at the same time. You can only resolve this as that's because Satan's governing everything. Because at the end of the day, he's the father of lies, and at the end of the day, these are a bunch of BS artists. Parmenides is a pederast. These guys are going to introduce the same monastic principle of, if Brahman is self and Brahman is originally alone, if you want to be more spiritual, the first thing you got to do is get rid of marriage and get rid of having children as lower vogal carnal desires. And out of that, you're going to find out they definitely have temptations and actual cases of homosexuality, mutual masturbation, pedophilia, the whole works. Up to the present, documented and caught, just like the Catholic priests and the monks. Okay, it's the same thing. This is paganism. Paganism is paganism, even if it has a Christian veneer. Okay? And this guy is going to come up with the first arguments that tell people how this is going to be alone. And he's going to do this by trying to talk King Ganaka into stop asking him questions, as a way to hopefully dissuade him from asking anymore and just accept our wisdom. Okay? And so what the king does is, this king is curious, and so he keeps asking him questions, and he's just like, oh, all the stuff you've heard is true, and this is why this is true, and this is why this is true, and it's out of that basis that he essentially comes up with Brahma. He also establishes reincarnation on the basis of dreams. So what he's going to say about reincarnation, and this is almost the exact same thing Parmenides says, everything is true and you can't prove that it's not, and you also cannot prove what's absolutely true, so therefore everything is true from a perspective as far as we can possibly know. It's like the bunch of guys, blind guys, feeling up the elephant and figuring out it's a wall, it's a rope, it's a spear, and it's the same thing. Okay, well, he has pretty much the same idea, and he just uses it to BS around the basis of everything is Brahman, just like Parmenides is saying everything is the monad. Self, monad, literally monk means monarch, which means one who is alone, and the monad is the lone one. Logos to logic is monasticism to the monad. Okay? So he's going to basically be doing this Q&A with the king. Out of that, he's going to explain how Brahman is like many and one, kind of like the web of a spider all goes back to a spider, and he's going to credit this to this King Gagaria, this sage Gagaria, who had taught these earlier princes of Videhas this, and this is one of the ways sages would establish themselves, as saying, I'm not the one saying this. It came from this guy, that came from this guy, this is the original OG teaching. Once they've established reincarnation, you can just go be like, oh, that's because it's 10,000 years older than their tradition, and I just remember it from a past life. See how easy it is when you got reincarnation to, oh, I just know. I'm wiser than all the gods. This is just my 18,000th reincarnation. Okay? And so he's going to explain reincarnation as in all the gods being Brahmanism as like all the vessels going out from the heart. It's all Brahman. It's all one, but it's just a bunch of different facets of the one experiencing different things. Just like Parmenides is basically going to say how we're all essentially God's thoughts, the monad's thoughts. Okay? And then he's just answering all the king's questions. The king's like, oh, you're so wise. Let me and my whole kingdom be your slaves. In other words, we are submitting to Brahmanism as a system. And this is how he sells Brahmanism to the kingdom of Videhas. After that, it just skips to this other dialogue where Yagnavalkya is in kind of it's saying he's in a dialogue with a king that he doesn't want to be in, but he offered the king a boon due to an earlier dispute over sacrifice. So what's the whole point of sacrifice? The whole point of sacrifice is these guys making money. So your primary source of wealth is cattle, and you're donating cattle to be sacrificed, and not all the cattle is getting sacrificed at once. You're just donating it to perpetuate the system, and then these guys send out guys to herd the cattle and multiply them, and they got lands and cattle, and they multiply their wealth. Okay? And so he's gotten into a dispute with the king over sacrifice and the importance and the meaning of it, and because of this, he's already got an issue with the king. The king is sniffing out, I think this whole system is BS. And he's questioning. And then he knows he doesn't want to have this dialogue with his king, but he offered him a boon because of this dispute about a sacrifice, and so now he's stuck giving the boon. And a boon is like an IOU, and so the IOU is giving up knowledge to him, basically. And so the king is asking him all these questions, and he's giving these answers to these kings about Brahman and reincarnation and stuff like that. And then it says, knowing that if he gave up all of his knowledge to the king's a smart cookie. He's figuring out really quickly, if I have all this mystery knowledge, what do I need you for? Why is the Brahmin my conduit to God, to pleasing the gods and all this other stuff, if reincarnation is the thing? And you're literally teaching me that the gods themselves are reincarnated, and so they're not even as high as we should get. Where we really want to get to is not reincarnating anymore and going through these cycles. And so he tells the king, if you want to really get wise, you need to get to a place where you fear nothing, including death. And if you get there, you can escape this life without being reincarnated, being one with Brahma. Because you are one with Brahma. It's just a matter of, well, why am I experiencing this separation from Brahma then, which is life? And he's explaining to him that your dreams are proof that you go through all these lives, because you can experience the dream and like get hurt in the dream or have pleasure in the dream and then wake up and you're completely unattached from what you're experiencing in the dream, and that's what lives are like. Okay? And he's saying you can get to a place where you're able to do this consciously, in other words, dream with astral projection consciously, and experience all the knowledge of past lives and the gods and all the stuff like this through astral projection. And then you can get to a place where you recognize that you are one with Brahman and one with everything, and beyond good and evil, beyond sexuality, beyond love and hate, beyond need, beyond desire, beyond fear even of death. And when you get to this place, you're one with Brahman, and when you die, you'll go to Brahman world and you won't reincarnate again. You reach the highest heaven from their perspective. And this king is basically like, tell me how to get there. And they're not expressly saying only a Brahmin can get there, but it's clear that later on that's what the system evolves to, because that is their way of keeping their power, is what they create the extra two castes, because it's just the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas in both the Upanishads and all the way back to the Rig Veda. So this tradition of 700 years only has two castes in it. And it's really just the rulers and the priests, like every other system of kings and priests. And then they add a couple more, which is basically the merchant class and the producing class. And then eventually they're going to add the untouchable class. And what the idea is you have to be in your caste, which is basically your socioeconomic group. So imagine our socioeconomic groups are basically, janitors, and then up above the janitors is going to be your factory workers and farmers. Above the farmers is your merchants, although they would put the producers above. Above your merchants is, that's your business people, basically. Above your business people is your politicians, and your religious leaders are at the top. Benny Hinn and those guys. And so they invent these extra castes, and the idea is you have to submit to your caste level and be the best poopsmith you can be, or businessman, or whatever, and you eventually graduate upward, and from the Brahmana class you can graduate to Brahmin world, which is escaping the cycle of reincarnation. And this is essentially a model of it, okay? This doesn't come from the Forest Upanishad, it comes from the Chanda Yoga Upanishad, but it's the idea that Yama lives in the moon, and the way they're going to explain this system is they're going to claim that this kid who was offered up as a human sacrifice to his dad, and yes, there's human sacrifice and suicide cults and all kinds of stuff in this, demons and all kinds of stuff in this. They're going to say he was sacrificed by his dad because his dad just didn't like him, and he goes up to the moon, which is where Yama lives and where they dole out people's reincarnation stats based on their karma, because their karma gets eaten by the gods, and once the gods are done feasting on their karma, they're going to be reduced down to basically their soul substance and put back in some other woman's belly to become a new baby. And how they behave themselves, how much karma they have, is going to establish whether they go up or down the caste ladder up to the Brahmanas, and the Brahmanas can go to Brahman world and essentially be united with Brahman, one with Brahman, and in this high elevated place in the highest heaven. But those beneath go to the moon, and then they go back. So the lower castes go to the moon, and the reincarnated wise, in other words, people who are trying to get better, are going to, depending on how good they did, go into higher castes or stay in the same caste. The people who don't care about the teaching, and this is in the Forest Upanishad, in other words, they're willfully ignorant. They don't want to know about the mysteries of the Brahmins. They get reincarnated as lower creatures like dogs and creepy things and bugs and slugs and stuff like this, which is the exact same thing they have in Plato's Timaeus. Exact same thing. Okay? This cannot be coincidental. It's either demonically inspired by the same people across the world, or it all comes from Egypt, and they're all saying the same thing. Okay? We don't have it because most of the stuff is verbal. Only the Greeks are really writing it down. Even this is not going to be written down for like 1,000 years from now. It's just going to be orally memorized. So these are the mysteries. And so the willfully ignorant come back, and they can go all the way down to the lower levels of hell. So the idea of the 7 layers of hell, which goes all the way back to Inanna and the descent of Inanna, which is much, much, much older than this. They have that too. The 7 hells. They have kind of versions of the 7 heavens, but not really. They have the idea of, if your karma maxed, if you've maxed out your karma by bone smashing, if your karma maxed, you get to go up and be a god, and gods just live a super long time and eat other people's karma for a living. But it's just a really, really long time. They'll eventually be reincarnated too. It's just that they add millions and billions of years to the earth, and on that basis, you can make up almost anything if you add millions and billions of years, which is why your scientists do it. Okay? So only the Brahmanas are the ones who go to Brahmin world, they're heaven, and so your goal is to be reincarnated as a Brahmin, and from there you can know Brahmin and then become one with Brahmin in your next life. However, in the original rendition of this nonsensical BS, Yajnavalkya is not saying this. This is what's going to evolve after him because of the predicament Yajnavalkya gets himself into. See, Yajnavalkya is basically, when asked, how do you do this? He says, you have to get to a place where you give up your house, you don't want a wife, you don't want kids, you just recognize you're one with Brahma, and Brahma is self, and Brahma is alone, and so you're content to be alone. You wander the forest pretty much naked. You don't get anything except for begging for your basic sustenance. You don't want anything. If people are mean to you, that's fine. We're all Brahma. You take it all on the chin. You forgive everything. And you just let life happen, knowing you're one with Brahma, and you'll transcend, and you'll be beyond good and evil. He's literally saying you'll have nothing in this world, but you'll transcend to become Brahma when you die. And why is he saying this to the king? He knows the king is not going to do this. That's the whole plan. And he even says it in the thing. He doesn't want to give him any more mystery knowledge, because if he gets all the mystery knowledge, he'll remove him from all of his offices. In other words, my role as the chief apostle of the NAR is finished once this guy figures out everything I know. And so what does he do? He invents a thing that says, in order to get to my level, you need to give up your wife, your kids, and be a homeless wandering beggar. And what does the king respond? He doesn't say, oh, I don't want to do that. He treats him as if that's what he's done, and says, oh, that's who you are? Me and my kingdom will be your slaves. In other words, you are our spiritual leader because you are that. Because he is saying, first of all, he's already told him, you're the wisest of the Brahmanas, which means you know Brahmin more than all the other sages and Brahmin teachers and priests. And you're saying in order to get to that level, this is what you have to be. A homeless wandering monk with no wife, no kids. The problem is, he has 2 wives and an estate. And he got into this whole mess in the first place because he wanted cattle and gold. And he told the king already he's in it for the money and the wisdom. And it doesn't say what transpires in his motives beyond this. It just says that he said what he said because he didn't want the king to know all his mystery knowledge and kick him out of his offices. And what does he end up with? Crap. This king, who's already gotten pissed off at me about sacrifices, whose kingdom I am beholden to, but he acts like they're following me, thinks I am this guy who's given up wife and kid and home and everything and is gone in the forest to be a wandering monk. I actually have to do this now. Crap. And it goes back to him explaining to his wife, hey, I have to go in the forest and be a wandering monk. Just want to say goodbye to you. You're both great. You're more inclined towards philosophy, so I'm going to tell you this wise saying, and here's the stem where it comes from, and gives yet another inconsistent genealogy. Gives her some wisdom and stuff like this. And then the rest of the things are teachings that his disciples had from him afterwards. And this stuff literally arranges from how to max out sexually pleasing your wife based on the meditation on self. Everything is about self. So the more you meditate on yourself, the better you can be for everyone else, including sexually pleasing your wife. He's like, if you want to have a kid that's white, black, brown, or whatever, do this kind of sacrifice or that kind of sacrifice. So it's like Vedic stuff that's superstitious. It's stuff having to do with what's going to become things like yoga and the Karma Sutra. Other Upanishads are going to take the breathing practices of these other priests who offer up the sacrifices and make all this mystical stuff about in breathing, up breathing, back breathing, forward breathing, which is just basically mouth in and out, nose in and out, and make up all this mystical stuff about the breath, and then come up with a theology that says you're inducing states of discomfort, which is what yoga is part of the process of denying yourself, or they don't call it denying yourself, they're saying focusing on yourself, but essentially denying the world as a means to ascend to Brahman world. Okay, so it's all about do this stuff and you become a mystical genius, and then you will become one with Brahman when you die and you don't reincarnate. It's almost as genius as saying, give us some more money and we'll get your dead relatives out of purgatory that doesn't exist. It's that level of bullcrap, okay? But the guy who first does it, his disciples are writing this down. It's like his wife and his disciples are writing this stuff down. And they capture his motives. And his motives are literally just him wanting money, him being afraid of losing his offices, him not wanting to answer the king, but he does answer the king. And he eventually paints himself into a corner of basically making it sound like the way he has to legitimize himself or risk the wrath of the king is by becoming this wandering mystic monk. And that is literally how the whole entire tradition of wandering mystic monks arrange. And so you see he has a bull, he has beads here. This is a much more modern rendition. All this stuff wasn't original. These original guys would have yellow or orange robes and a bull. Why? They have the most basic clothing to cover themselves, and some treat it as modesty, others treat it as a basic modicum of comfort, and then a bowl from which to beg for alms. And their whole life is wandering through the forest, meditating on mystical knowledge, in this guy's case of the Vedas and the Upanishads, and then begging for food. And these guys become this class of people who just wander around begging for food and then saying wise sayings every now and again. They do have free food, but they're stuck being celibate and they can't have kids. But the whole point is not to have any more kids, because it's your inclination to want to have kids and all this stuff that keeps you bound to this world. The Greeks are going to say the same thing. And it's that basis that leaves you stuck reincarnating. It's wanting to do stuff to receive wealth. It's pleasing the gods in order to be reincarnated into a better life. Pleasing the gods in order, because they have all these different sayings and rituals and patterns of habit that are based on in order to have good sex, in order to have beautiful kids, in order to get a good wife, in order to multiply wealth, in order to be famous. All this stuff is literally just like, do this and you'll get these carnal things, kind of like Think and Grow Rich. In fact, it's very much like Think and Grow Rich, because they base all this on mentalizing and envisioning what you have and what you want, because you're Brahmin and you're God, so you can make it happen. At the same time, though, they paint themselves in the corner because God is alone, and in order to really get to the level, you need to be a monk. And the question is, if this created sexual deviancy among the Catholic priests and monks, did it among the Hindu and Buddhist monks? And the answer is yes, it did. We don't have a lot of documentation in the ancient world, but we have documentation in the modern world. But we're not going to talk about that now until we get to the later systems of Mahavira and Buddha. So Mahavira his real name is Vardahama or something like that. And he is Lord Mahavira. It literally means, Vira, member, means hero. Maha means great, great hero, Mahavira. Okay, in Sanskrit, Mahavira. These guys, it's interesting because these guys just basically become the new form of ancestor worship because they build idols and temples to them, and most people are not so spiritual. They just tell you how great they are and offer up incense to them and bow down to statues of them. It's really interesting how it goes like that. Well, these guys are not really saying, worship me. They're saying, follow my path to liberation. But you can only follow their path to liberation from the samsara cycle or the reincarnation cycle is by being a wandering, lonely monk who is increasingly miserable in the Jain tradition. In the Jain tradition, they have to be butt naked. It's awful. Let's flip over to the Jain tradition. The Jain tradition is going to come first of these traditions, and it seems to come rather quickly. There seems to be a guy who's roughly contemporary with Yajnavalkya, who Mahavira, which his real name is Varnahadra or whatever, he's going to claim that he was the 24th Tirgantha, which basically means ford maker. Okay? The idea is kind of like getting over the river Styx by the boatman. There's the idea of crossing the river or the flood to get to the next life, similar to Egypt here. And the ford maker is the guy who, a ford would be a point in the river where it's shallow enough where you can walk across. And the ford maker is the one who makes the way for you to cross the river. Okay? The Jain worldview is basically just one-upsmanship on the Brahmin worldview. That's all it is. So remember, the original oldest stuff never said anything about you need to be a Brahmin to achieve this liberation or samsara cycle. And based on the writings of the Jains and the Buddhists, it's clear that that idea is starting to become prominent, but it's not this absolute thing. Nobody is treating Brahma like he is Brahman is like the highest god and all the gods are him. They're not treating it like that, okay? So there's multiple versions of this, because remember, these guys are in the habit of BSing and saying these other Brahmins who are saying different mystical things, because they're making them up, are actually all mysteriously the same thing, which is Brahman is God, okay? Nobody's buying this. And the reason is because the Vidihas kingdom, who they sell it to, falls apart in like a generation. And these guys that become Mahavira and Buddha are basically princes of the former ruling class of the Vidihas ruling elite. And their king who started this thing started in conversations with Yajnavalkya, who never said anything about having to be a Brahmin before you accomplish this. And so you have guys who are trying to advance down this pathway that Yajnavalkya has described, which is basically like disconnecting from everything and recognizing that it's all about you and yourself and meditating on yourself until you escape all of your desires to get to the point where you don't come back reincarnated again. Okay, so they all have in common monasticism, celibacy. You do have orders of male and female monks, and you do have this idea of escaping the cycle of reincarnation, which they call samsara, which is based on karma, and that law, that cosmic system of legalism, is called Dharma, basically is cosmic law, okay? So they all have a version of Dharma, but it's not the same thing. It's just, that's what they call it, but they have different doctrines, okay? So it'd be like calling it the law of God or something, the New Testament, let's call it, for their perspective. Vedism and the sacrificial system is their Old Testament, and escaping samsara cycle is their New Testament. In fact, it's exactly that. I mean, Vedism is basically their Mosaic law, the Vedic sacrificial system, and then Brahmanism, Buddhism, and Jainism are basically three versions of false Christ and false messiahs who tell you how they're going to make the way for you to have eternal life. And eternal life to them means not being reincarnated. And the Jains are basically going to say the escaping samsara is about never again being incarnated. In other words, never again having a physical body. And so the goal is to reach Siddhashila, which is basically being internally disembodied but conscious individual soul, beyond Brahma and the other gods who are in Brahma world. Okay. They both have a version of Brahma as the most high god, which makes sense because Brahma is based on Rama, and that would be common all over India. And that seems to be a common thing outside of the Kuru Vedic tradition. Brahma is juxtaposed to Mara, which means the destroyer, so it's kind of like their version of God and the devil. Okay? But to them, Brahman world is not this place of liberation where you're one with Brahman. It's just where Brahma and the other gods hang out. It's basically the third heaven, if you will. So it's beyond the world. It's the world of the gods. But Siddhishala is beyond that. That's where you never come back as a god because they see Brahma and the other gods. Remember, not Brahman, but Brahma and the other gods. They're all gods that have a created origin. They don't acknowledge Brahman as the supreme reality of the universe or the monad. They treat Brahma like he's just the oldest of the gods. Where did he come from? The universe was eternal. So they treat it like that, kind of like the cosmic waters of Egypt's theology, but their goal is to get to the point where they never come back. They're not a god. They're still an individual consciousness, but they never come back and experience a bodily form, and therefore they cannot suffer. So the Dharma is this. The chief rule of Dharma in both Jainism and Buddhism is suffering is bad. And this really got me thinking about suffering as a Christian and realizing how suffering is the essence of what it is to love. This is why love is long-suffering. Is the first thing Corinthians says. Love is long-suffering and is kind. What does this mean? It means you suffer other people's mistakes, other people's wants, other people's time, and kind, which means you think of other people as you think of yourself. Kind. We're of the same kind, and so therefore treat them how I would want to be treated. Love is long-suffering and kind. And then it goes on to describe how love behaves itself. Love is long-suffering and is kind. Okay? And everything else in Corinthians. So you can't have love without having free-willed people who want things distinct from what you want. And those things you adjudicate as okay and permit them. In other words, it's not all about you and getting what you want. And by permitting what they want when it's different than what you want, whether that's waiting for your wife to get ready in the bathroom before you go to the thing you want to do, or honoring your mother and father and not doing the thing they told you not to do that you want to do, or being God and forgiving everyone's sins, or being Jesus and dying on the cross, you are suffering out of what you've allowed for within the context of the other person having a free will. And because you're doing that without destroying them or getting rid of them or walking away from them permanently because they suck, that is what love is. Okay? Love is long-suffering and is kind. That's what patience means. So patience, just waiting, is a form of suffering. There will always be suffering in some form, even in eternity. There won't be violence and malice and sin and harm. But guess what? In eternity, with everlasting life, waiting is not harm. Suffering ceases to be evil. In this life, however, waiting might be harmful. I gotta eat. I gotta sleep. So what I suffer might cause me bodily harm, but in eternity it won't. So there will always be suffering, but their rule is suffering is bad. Embodiment is suffering. Disembodiment is the goal. Non-violence is the way to achieve the goal, and disinterestedness is the key to the goal. Okay? And so what they're saying is, I meditate on myself, and in meditating on myself, if I'm Mahavir, the great hero, I've come to the conclusion that everything is wrapped up in your bodily desires. All bodily desires are evil. See, the Christian worldview is no, sin. Bodily desires that are not subordinate to the will of God. That is evil. They're like, no, bodily desires, period, is evil. Is it evil that I'm thirsty and I want to drink? No. And so what they would do is they would start up a program, and it's just this really advanced legalistic monastic program that talks about all the things you can't do and how you do them and how you're supposed to do them. And it basically is these guys have to walk around butt naked in the forest with a bowl and basically a brush, like a cobweb feather brush cleaner. And that is to dust away gently any bugs that might be where you're going to sit, because it's all about non-harming anything else. And the key to non-harm is not just not doing violence, but not caring, not having preferences, not desiring anything, being indifferent to everything. And that is how they believe you escape the cycle of reincarnation. Just don't care about anything. It's a very self-absorbed system, but all the systems are self-absorbed. The Brahmins are self-absorbed. These guys are self-absorbed. It's literally systematic self-absorption. The Brahmins are interesting because some of them are very much about, they believe in this enlightened state of liberation from reincarnation, and others are just about the wealth and stuff that you get from being at the top of the system. And it's very paradoxical, which is why it's not selling to a lot of people. In fact, they're going to go through a period of several hundred years where people are way more into Jainism and Buddhism than they are into Brahmanism, because Brahmanism is very hypocritical. Okay? You're saying it's all about giving up everything and not wanting everything, and yet you're multiplying lands and wealth and people. And you're like, yeah, but I'm going to give them up in my old age, and you have to have it to give it up, so give me your money, says Benny Hinn. Well, these guys are taught the teaching from Yajnavalkya, which the other Upanishads, I think there's like 10 of them, they're kind of rehashing and reverberating the same basic tenets with different forms of mystical proofs to prove why it's valid. And they're always different proofs because they're just making it up, and they're not necessarily giving props to who came up with the idea first. But we know from internal witnesses within the text which one's first and second, and not all of them, but we know which ones are the earliest and which ones are more derivative. And the later ones are going to actually be telling you these other shramanas, that's what the Jains and the Buddhists and these other monks who are trying to escape to liberation are doing, but they're denying the Vedic sacrificial system. They're basically treat them like they're heresies, and these guys are not true Brahmanas, and they're not going to get there. Where these guys, the Jains and the Buddhists, are like, no, actually, the true Brahmana, it's very similar to Paul saying the true Jew is the Jew who's in the heart, rather than the Jew who keeps the law. It's very similar to that. They're saying the true Brahmana is the one who has really given up everything he wants in this world. These other Brahmanas who say they're Brahmanas that have all this stuff, they're less spiritual than us. It is very similar to Paul in the true Jew. Okay? And basically the Jains are going to have this thing where essentially their program is this. You go around begging, you say some wise things, but you're mostly meditating on the wise sayings of him, which is just this short book of, I think it's like a few hundred pages total, but I think like the actual monastic teaching is like 100 pages, and it's all about stuff that is literally about making sure you're not enjoying anything, making sure you're not having a preference, making sure you're not trying to get your way with anyone, and it's really about passivity. It's about taking the minimal amount of your food you need, not getting too comfortable. You can bum a couch off of somebody to sleep in, and you can bum a bowl of food, but it can't be good food. It can't be an animal that was killed expressly for you. They can eat meat. Now Jains are vegetarian, but they weren't back then. It was less about the vegetarianism than about the intent. So if somebody gives you meat, you can eat it, but not if they're killing the animal to give you meat. So it's very systematic, it's very logical, but the key is you don't have preferences. You're not trying to get what you want in this world or enjoy anything in this world. You're just going through this minimal subsistence of existence, and the whole point is to sit there naked in the forest and meditate all day, and then beg food and sleep at night. That's it. That's all you do. And you're supposed to get into these postures that are pretty uncomfortable, and it's kind of where yoga comes from. It's derivative of a number of different systems. Yogis are basically just Vedic versions, Brahmin versions of Jains and Buddhists, but you sit in these postures that are about disinterestedness. And what a disinterested mean is like you're not sitting in a way that's comfortable, but you're also not deliberately trying to get comfortable. Don't want to live, don't want to die. It's just indifference is the key. Indifference, I don't care to the umpteenth degree with my life. And you sit in these uncomfortable postures. You're supposed to pull out your hair every so often. You're not supposed to have hair. It's about like self-humiliation, shame, indifference, wanting as little as possible. John the Baptist on steroids. And then at the end of it, when you get to the point where you can't maintain this boring, uncomfortable posture, you're supposed to fast until you die. When you're too old and tired to be able to maintain this boring, uncomfortable posture, you're supposed to fast until you die. So commit suicide. Well, it's not suicide. Yes, it is. Even by Indian law, they're saying it's suicide, and we're not endorsing this because suicide is against the law. It's definitely suicide. Of course, Indians had other traditions of women killing themselves by burning themselves alive with their husbands when they die, and Buddhists had traditions of burning themselves alive. Okay? Why? It's all about escaping the body. And so, to burn yourself alive, if you can justify it as for someone else, like in protest, yeah, that's the easy way out. And so the Jains would go through these things. Now, there's specific things in there about them talking about, warning about drinking alcohol, hanging out at parties, getting their free food from a festival or anything enjoyable. And then it also warns against them sleeping in mixed company. Warning specifically about them being tempted towards having sex with female nuns or eunuchs, which seem to be he-she boys, which they have in Thailand to this day. Okay? So yes, homosexuality and sexual deviancy and getting your release, even though technically you're not having sex, seems to be not prolific, but common enough within the construct of what they're trying to do that they have to write down certain rules that are meant to avert that kind of behavior. Okay? And all this stuff, again, it amounts to being boring as boring as boring as boring as boring, can be in passive as passive as passive, can be in not harming anyone else and not having any preferences for yourself, and then dying in a supreme passivity, starving to death, fasting to death. And when you do this, they're going to bury you in a box, or they're going to put you in a box in the Jain posture and burn your corpse, and they're going to auction off your hair, and they're going to, there's a whole system of money making and devotion and stuff like that that's built around this, like every other cult, because it's just a cult. At the end of the day, it's just a cult. Just because the cult leader's a true believer doesn't make it not a cult, okay? It's a cult. But it's built on the premises that Yajnavalkya establishes. It's just Mahavira's version of it that, based on what Yajnavalkya said, and he doesn't mention Yajnavalkya, he mentions this other teacher that's kind of contemporary with him, it seems like that, based on this and also descriptions and narratives of writings of this stuff among them and among the Buddhists, it's very clear that the original Brahmins looked at these Shramanas, which were basically, Shramanas are basically Brahmanas that are not Brahmins, but they're essentially people who are undergoing this path like Yajnavalkya described to escape the world, but they're not Brahmanas, and they're still just trying to escape the cycle of reincarnation. And whether this was originally a belief that they're going to a different place because they're not Brahmins and only Brahmins unite with Brahman, which actually makes sense. I haven't found this written anywhere, but that actually makes sense. It seems to be basically another way to get to heaven in their worldview. Okay? If you're not a Brahmin. It's a shortcut. It's a shortcut because you are more miserable than they are. You're butt naked. But if you want to just karma max and become a god, you can try to do that too. And if you want to take the slow road and just max until you become a Brahmana and go up to Brahman world, you can do that too. And they talk about that. You can do that. But the true Brahmas are the people who really hate their life until the bitter end. And then they never come back. Buddha one-ups Jainism. And there are people who think Buddha and Mahavira knew each other. Based on the things I've read, and there's tens of thousands of pages of Buddhist stuff that I don't care to read all of. But based on what I've read, Buddha seems to have dialogues with multiple Jain disciples, but there's nothing to suggest that Mahavira is alive, because if he was alive, it seems like Buddha would want to dialogue with him and prove that he's superior. And he doesn't. What he seems to be doing is pulling disciples from the Jains through his going to them and convincing them that his way is wiser. Kind of like Joseph Smith pulled a bunch of disciples from the Church of Christ, proving that he's the OG restorationist of the church because he's bringing back the prophetic gifts. Okay? Cult leaders do as cult leaders do. And Buddha is definitely a cult leader. He is definitely an occult mystic. He asserts himself as having psychic powers, which he basically describes as the ability to astrally project, which, again, starts with Yajnavalkya and those guys. The power to read minds, which he expresses in multiple of his narratives and teachings, which seem to be from him originally in the first person and then memorized by his disciples. I'm sure there's plenty of stuff mythologized and made up by him, but most of the things that come from Buddha seem to be about how Buddha is wiser than everybody else. And he is very arrogant. Mahavira basically comes to a point where he's the most enlightened, and he basically seems to be like a very legalistic monastic head. Like it's a head of a monastic order, and he just seems to be a very legalistic person, and he seems to be more about the process than himself, even though he meditated on himself to get there. Buddha seems to be about himself receiving worship. He really does. Buddha basically goes through this process where he's going to sit under multiple teachers that are similar to Mahavira, and there are several of these schools. We just mostly know about Buddhism and Jainism because those are the two schools that were patronized by the Mauryan Empire, again, post-Alexander the Great. And so they would have gotten some royal munties to go build monasteries and groups of monks that can memorize their stuff, and it's after that that their writings get canonized. We have no reference to these writings having been original. Christianity is so much more better documented than this stuff. But they do seem to be traditions that are semi-canonical, and that kind of final version of them seems to be within 200 to 300 years of the lives of these guys, probably 200 on the shallow end. So you do have some memorization that apparently seems to be going down. That memorization seems to be canonized during the Maurya Gupta Empire when they're finalized, while these other schools, if you don't have traditions of people to keep memorizing the stuff until they get a script hundreds of years later, it's gone. So there's at least between Buddhism, the writings of Buddhism and Jainism that I found, there's at least 5 other schools, and probably half a dozen other sages that are not Brahmins, plus many sages that are Brahmins. Okay, so think of it like the Greek philosophers. There's a bunch of different schools and philosophers running down, but the Greeks have writing before they get their philosophers. Their Jains have, or the Hindus have philosophers way before they get writing. And so it's all relying on traditions of memorization, which works best if you have a priestly order or a monastic system to organize people to memorize stuff, and the Buddhists win that contest by far. So Buddha just means the awakened one, and he is not the first person called a Buddha. In fact, there's Brahmins called Buddhas. Mahavira is definitely called a Buddha, but he's not called the Buddha, the awakened one. He doesn't get this title. Buddha never calls himself the Buddha. He does reference a Bodhi or a Buddha, which basically means an awakened one, but he calls himself, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but Tegarthana or something like that, but literally means like the one who's arrived. That's literally, and he calls himself this again and again. It's like Jesus calling himself the Son of Man, but he calls himself the one who arrived. And even though that sounds like a super gangster rap artist name, it's actually more of the idea of him being an apostle from Brahma, because his testimony is that he studies under this one guy, masters his teaching, the guy wants him to kind of co-lead his school. He says, no, I'm not satisfied that I'm truly enlightened. And then another guy, he masters his teaching, and the guy says, oh, why don't you take over my school when I die, or co-lead or whoever. And he's like, no, I'm not convinced that I'm truly enlightened again. And then he goes on his journey, and again, same journey where he shaves his head. He's not naked like the Jains. The Jains are the ones who make themselves naked. There may have been others who were naked before them, but most of these monks wear some kind of simple robe, both as modesty and also as a way of keeping themselves basically warm, basically free from the elements. The Jains are like, if a bug starts biting you, just let it happen. If an animal starts eating you, just let it happen. Be naked. If it starts snowing, raining, whatever, just let it happen. It's just all about like, you don't get to be like, this is uncomfortable, I'm going to roll over. It's just the most legalistic version of self, whatever, asceticism as you can get. But anyways, the Jain system seems to acknowledge the caste, because it talks about Kshatriyas and Brahmas a lot, because they're the ones who basically seem to be trying to prove that a Kshatriya can get there and not just a Brahmin. There's no reference in Jainism to the other castes either. Those ideas seem to come a couple hundred years later. Buddha specifically denies the caste system, and he may have been before the caste system started to emerge either, but the caste system seems to be something that's just BS together for the Brahmins to make multiple layers of people beneath them so they have steps to climb on their way towards getting to being one of them so they can reincarnate out of this mofo. The rest of it seems to be about selling a system that preserves a certain amount of social order without upward mobility, and those people being content with that as a virtue, which is a good selling point to kings. You have a stratified society where nobody is trying to revolt or start a union or try to get more from the people above them. Sounds pretty good for a lot of people. Buddhism is specifically casteless, but we don't know if this is things having to do with things Buddha says or his disciples after him. A lot of the stuff is by his disciples, and it's very clear that it is. A lot of stuff is about Buddha and probably embellished, and a lot of stuff seems to be from Buddha and semi-original, kind of like how nobody gets Jesus' words exactly the same in the Gospels, but there's enough there that we know Jesus probably said that. Maybe not those exact words, but that meaning, okay? They have the same thing with Mara, the destroyer, and Brahma. Both are still there. Buddha claims that after he finally gets enlightened, after, basically, I learned from the greatest, and after I realized that, there's still more to learn, I self-taught. And I self-taught by basically meditating until I was projecting, until I saw the universe and the gods and everything and understood everything. And now I have arrived. I am there, okay? And so he mentions how he's like so arrived, and he's like, well, what should I do? I should probably just go off and be alone until I go die and reincarnate. And what he claims, like every humble cult leader, I just wanted to go disappear. And then this guy whose name basically means the eternal Brahma, or the enduring Brahma, but it's Brahma. You can ask, and they'll be like, "Oh, this is someone different." And it's like, no, it's not. It's freaking Brahma. There's enough writings where he talks about Brahma and Brahma world, and Brahma and Mara being the main two gods, and listing them among other gods. It's very clear it's Brahma. Okay. Brahma appears to him and says, "No, you need to teach the people. You're the wisest person that's ever lived." And there's other, things where he's got a monk who comes to him and he's saying, "I was astral projecting and I met Brahma and I asked Brahma the answer to this question." And Brahma said, "I don't know. Go ask, whatever his name is, the one who's arrived, and whatever he tells you, believe." In other words, Brahma, who's their most high god in the Hindu system, is saying, Buddha's smarter than me. Because Buddha is next level. And Buddha's system is this, where the Jains say bodily existence is suffering, therefore you want to be a disembodied spirit. He's the same thing. Dharma, the primary rule of Dharma is suffering is bad. Conscious existence is suffering, but all conscious existence is suffering. Non-conscious existence is the goal. Non-harm is the way. Okay? Buddha is going to focus much more on a system that is a little bit more pragmatic. It's about doing things that please other people. Not necessarily doing things for them, but doing things in a way that's pleasant, socially acceptable, moderated, very self-controlled, this is why these demon-possessed Bodhis go around and they're so cute and goofy, okay? They're all about being these happy little Santa Claus gnomes or whatever they are, when they're really just demon-possessed weirdos who actually have quite a bit of pedophilia and stuff among them. This is why, Thailand, which is a Buddhist nation, is like the pedophilia capital of the world. Okay? They have the same thing. Brahma inhabits Brahman world with a god. You can go there, but there's no caste system that you need to get there. It's just all about you having enough karma by doing enough good deeds. So you can be a Buddhist lay votary, and same thing with Jains. You can have lay votaries, and lay votaries can have wives and have kids and act according to the Buddhist way and get better karma to be reincarnated as a god or as a higher level person that comes back as a monk in the next life. And their primary goal is to give free food and shelter to the Buddhists. Of course, the Buddhists have temples and stuff like that are donated to them by kings and rich people and stuff like that, so they have permanent shelters and stuff. They've gotten established. But the point is that you can have a life and be a Buddhist, but you're a lay votary. You're not one who's going to escape reincarnation. You will be back. But this might be a step in the right direction for you because you're, supporting the Buddhists and giving them free stuff so that they can navel gaze, and that's good karma. And so that will bring you back. Maybe you'll come back as one of them and have all the self-control to never get married, shave your head off, and wander around nothing but a robe with a bowl, and with your bald head, and then you can escape the cycle of reincarnation and be great one day, and people could pray to little statues of you, or you can. There's different schools that are going to evolve from this, like Zen Buddhism. And then I forget what they're called, but like big vehicle and small vehicle Buddhism. Small vehicle Buddhism is about your escape. Big vehicle Buddhism is about you being able to escape, but choosing to remain and keep coming back so as to enlighten other people to save the whole world. And that's what Bodhisattvas, and that's what the Tibetan Dalai Lama is all about, and the Pancha Lama. They're just people are like, yeah, I could go to heaven forever, but I'm here to help you. Again, karmic rebirth, same thing. Heavens and hells, lower and higher karmic rebirth, but the awakened get to this level. Now, based on what I've read from the Jain stuff, there's all kinds of fabrication in there. They make it sound like literally he has like 350,000 people in his sect by the time he dies 40 years later, with like 18 layers to like how many different hierarchies of groups of enlightened beings and supporters and all this different sages and magic wielders and weird stuff in his cult. There's no way he established like the entire Jedi order that fast. But they make it sound like he did because they're full of crap. The Buddhists are much more, at least in the writings that I've found, legit sounding in terms of their history and what actually happens. The Jains make it sound like this guy was moved from a Brahmin mother to a Kshatriya mother, so like a priest mother to a ruler mother, because Indra or Sakra wanted to prove that, Kshatriyas can get there too. And so he's somebody who could have been born a Brahma, but, Indra decided, no, maybe you should be born from another class to prove that they can get there too. Even though Indra's not there, so that doesn't make any sense. But Buddha was commissioned by Brahma, who is less enlightened than Buddha is, and that doesn't make any sense to be sent by someone who's less than you are. But if you ask ChatGPT, they'll make something up as a reason, which probably comes from Buddhists making up stuff as a reason. Okay? But Buddha is basically about getting to the place of, being a no-limit soldier, and then he is going to start with 3 monks who are just 3 monks who are helping him out on his own monastic journey. He's also going to fast and meditate for about half the time that Mahavira does to get to his conclusion, and he's going to be much more moderate in how much comfort he allows. It's the same basic premise of being selfless and indifferent to what happens in life, kind of being passive and que sera sera about it, and meditating and navel gazing, but it's less naked, less deliberately uncomfortable, and more socially conscious in terms of how you behave yourself versus just self-denying. Where the Jains are self-denying, but they're ridiculous. I mean, they're butt-ass naked. So, like, get out of here, dude. And then some Jains, they're going to actually have a split over people that say you can wear a robe. And other people's like, no, you got to be naked all the time. It's just stupid cult stuff. The goal of the Buddhists is to reach oblivion. The goal of the Jain is to be a disembodied soul. The goal of the Buddhist is just to be never conscious again. because all consciousness is suffering. He actually gets his concept of what suffering is right, but neither of these systems understand love. Jain says neither love or hate. Both are bad. Those are both wanting something. Buddha's like, be lovely. In other words, be pleasant. That's what he's saying. Be pleasant and respectable and attractive. And so the Buddhists much more are about being clean and attractive in the way they conduct themselves and the way they present themselves, where the Jains are more about being miserable. And they look like crap too. And there's two different people groups that are going to be, competing with each other over who's the more spiritual. And the answer is neither of you. Because Paul says about all this stuff that it does nothing to really mitigate the sinful desires of the flesh. And we have the proof of that right here. Bhutan's Buddhist monks accused of sexually molesting boys. That's 2013. Thailand, just as a country. Buddhism's pedophile monks. This is 2002. Horny monks in ancient Japan. How Catholic missionaries ruined same-sex relationships and sexuality on the island nation. The wink wink. There's just a lot of that. Child abuse in the clergy. There's examples of people doing what they called thigh sex, which is basically like pinch your legs together and let me give it a go. Or, monks, pederasts, monks. The same thing you have among the Catholic clergy and the Catholic monks. Same thing. How prolific is it? There are Catholic priests that are not abusing anyone and that are not gay. Okay? So it's that prolific. The point is, the monastic practices do nothing to mitigate the lust of the flesh. Okay? We cannot mitigate the lust of the flesh without God's help. Whether you're straight, whether you're single, whether you're married. The only way you can do this is with a gift of God. Okay? We all need to exercise self-control, and we're all capable to exercise self-control to degrees. But if I'm hanging around in the strip club all the time and constantly being, indulging my senses in that direction, eventually I'm going to fall. The way is to be led by the Spirit, not just away from that in your behavior, but away from that in your heart and your mind towards more beautiful things that are not based in fulfilling the lust of your flesh sinfully. Marriage can be one of those things. A gift of celibacy can be one of those things, but it's a rare gift, and it's very clear it's rare from church history and from the Bible itself. We have a handful of people in the entire Bible who are celibate. Many people in the Bible who are anointed by God yet have multiple wives, and some that have one. So it's the entire range of, human sexual desire is expressed in people used by God and, kind of exalted by God for their service to Him. Jesus is celibate, but he's not eternally celibate in the spiritual sense. So God's obviously not trying to communicate that celibacy is better because Jesus is getting a bride. This is something that I've had some people comment on. You don't seem to get it. Jesus is getting a bride. Even though that's mystical and spiritual, you have to understand Him putting on human flesh as an eternal being who's always existed and always will, putting on flesh for a minute duration of time. Okay? Less than I've lived on this earth. So Him being able to exercise self-control so as not to be married is okay, but the fact that He's getting a bride, and even though that is mystical in the church, demonstrates that God is not trying to paint a picture of monastic, monad-based celibacy as being the premier thing. In fact, He doesn't make it the premier thing. He talks about people making themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of God if they're able to bear it. In other words, if they have this gift, if they're able to bear this thing of making themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of God as a noble thing. So to say, I'm intentionally going to forego getting married so I can do the most I can for the kingdom of God and go and travel and missionary and do all this stuff and never have to worry about supporting wife and kids and never have to worry about them getting hurt, you have a choice to do that. But if you don't have the gifting to do that, you're going to fall. It's only a matter of time. You're going to fall. If you have the gifting to do that, that doesn't mean your junk's not working. It doesn't mean you are you can't get married. God has disallowed you from getting married. It means He's gifted you to be able to have this inordinate amount of self-control so that you won't fall into that temptation. Paul's very clear, not everybody has that. He has it, not everybody has it. He talks about his being able to have a wife, but he doesn't. He chooses to forego that in order to make sure that he's not simply spreading the gospel out of the compulsion of God making him. That's part of what he does, along with not taking pay. Okay? He chooses to do that because he is gifted and able by that gifting to be able to do that, but he is never in anywhere saying he's compelled to or he can't. Okay? And he's also saying he has a right to. He's also saying other apostles do. And the only instance of him saying it's better is based on a circumstance that has to do with fornication being prevalent and Christians being few. In other words, potential Christian spouses being few. And within that context, he allows people to marry pagans or Jews or whatever. Like, it's very clear he is not trying to paint celibacy as the better thing in general. And I've had people try to argue that in my channel, and I'm saying, no, that wrong idea is based in monadism, and it is the basis for the doctrine of demons, that is forced celibacy. When you're telling people that it's morally better to be celibate, you're saying you're at a higher spiritual class than those who are, and that's what turns into forced celibacy among the clergy. It's a wrong idea turned into a rule, and it's a doctrine of demons. And that doctrine is demonstrated both in Greek philosophy and in Hindu religion, which turns to pedophilia in both cases because it's not natural, and these people are not gifted to do the thing that they're trying to do in order to get themselves into a class of people determined to be more spiritual. It's not right. We don't do it. God designed the family unit to exemplify the Trinity. He designed Christ in the church to exemplify love and submission and obedience and dying to self in a sense that is reflected in the marriage union and covenant. Okay? The Trinity is reflected in the marriage union and covenant and procreation. Okay? That I'm going to write a book on this. It's definitely what it is. And the Antichrist is going to be against that. He is about the monad. He is about not caring about the desire of women, which is to procreate. It's the natural desire that is expressed throughout the whole Bible. And he is going to make a form of union that is asexual and non-sexual and non-procreative. That's about us maintaining our internal lives and not wanting to have kids anymore. That's what he's driving people towards with the mark of the beast. So, these things are important to me to say. It's not just, singleness or whether or not you want to be single or whether or not you can be single or whether or not you have self-control. Remember, you can have the gift of prophecy. That doesn't mean you're compelled to prophecy. You can have the gift of liberality. That doesn't mean you're compelled to give your money away. In the same way, everybody is called to speak as the oracles of God. So let your words match God's words. Everybody is called to be generous. They might not have the supernatural gift of doing it automatically like all the spiritual gifts, and celibacy is one of those spiritual gifts. The gift of being able to be a eunuch for the kingdom of God is a gift of an exorbitant amount of self-control. It's not a deviancy in nature. It's not a physical deformity, because Jesus is going to make a distinction between people who are born eunuchs, those are people with a physical deformity. People who are made eunuchs by men, those are people who physically have their nads cut off so that they can be in these roles or against their will. And people who make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of God, which the entire church has always agreed that is not actually castrating yourself. That is making yourself one who doesn't pursue wife and kids for the sake of the kingdom of God. You're like the servants to the king in the world who have their testicles cut off, but you're doing it by the power of the Spirit according to a gifting and a willing desire, versus by force and according to a demand by a king. So you're doing that for the kingdom of heaven willingly. And like all gifts, It doesn't make you better. It doesn't make you worse. Someone who has a gift of prophecy is not above or better than somebody who has a gift of healing or somebody who has a gift of liberality or the gift of mercy and forgiveness. Okay? We all have gifts. We're all united in one spirit. When we get to 1 Corinthians, we're going to drum this into your heads as hard as we can. No gift makes you better, nor is any gift a matter of possession and you not being able to control exercising the gift. It's God's power, your free will. Okay? Not better, not worse, but there's an appropriate way to use it. The spirit of the prophets is subject to the prophets, and you speak in tongues in the way that you should, and that goes for all the gifts. You don't get on other people's case for not being as generous as you are if you have the gift of liberality. Okay? So try to listen and try to understand that these errors did not just creep in the church. They were all over the world before they got to the church. And what I'm trying to do is exemplify to you guys the logical substance behind the error, so that when we get to these things in the Bible, you see what the truth of Scripture is, as opposed to the error of paganism, which comes into Catholicism and Calvinism and all these other things, all these other isms that create division in the body. So that's that. That's the three: the Buddhism, the Hinduism. I'm probably not going to go much deeper than that, although I'm going to write more than that in my book, Serpent by the Way. But I have to do the same thing with Greek philosophy, which I'm like 3/4 done with, and then I have to do that with Confucianism, Taoism, and a bunch of other Chinese philosophies, which I've barely scratched the surface of. I'm probably 10% done. So I'm going to do that through those three things, and then I'm going to get into the Greco-Roman conquest and the Second Temple period down to the time of Christ. And I am about 300 pages down out of 400, so it's looking like I think I'm on my 3 chapters after this. And it's coming along good. My goal of being done by this summer looks like it's on track, but I have to stay on it. So if you are inclined, please pray for me to stay on target like that guy on Star Wars. And I will keep dropping the wisdom as I come across it. So hope you guys are blessed by this. Have a great rest of the week. Batman out. Peace.
Peace, I'm out. I'm Batman.